All right, everyone got a good view of the slides? Everyone can hear me? All right, so this is Introduction to User Experience Design. Thank you, Imran, for the introduction. My name is Mariya, and for those of you that I haven't already met, I am the founder and creative director of Xanadu, which is a mobile and cross-platform design and strategy company based in San Francisco. So we partner with companies ranging from tiny startups to huge, multinational corporations with hundreds of millions of users to help them with their product design challenges. So before I go into the UX design content, I really want to get to know you guys a little bit better. So I want you to raise your hand, like who has a live product? You have a product that's already launched, that's in the market. Raise your hand. Okay, so a few of you, very brave, have already launched products. Now who is thinking of launching a new product? Everyone in here should be thinking of launching a new product. How many of you guys are maybe 3 months away from launching a product? Okay, kind of close. How many of you have like working prototypes? One person is a working prototype? Really? Really? Okay. How many of you guys are maybe like 6 months to a year away from launching your product? Okay. Cool, so it looks like we have a pretty wide mix. Some people already have products out. Some of you guys are still in the brainstorming phase. Some of you guys have prototypes going. So we're gonna start a really basic exercise, which is I want you guys to articulate what your product and business goals are and keep those in your mind while we're doing this workshop. So if you look in your workbook, everybody look in the workbook, on the very first page should be the product and business goals sheet. So I want you to think carefully and fill out these questions. For example, what are your goals for your business? What are your goals for your product? Who is your product for? Who are you designing for? What's your biggest advantage? And then what is your biggest challenge? So I'm gonna give you 5 minutes to think about this because it affects how you think about the rest of your user experience design. Does anyone want to share what their answers are to these 4 questions? Someone want to be brave? How about someone who has a live product already? Nobody wants to share this morning. You guys are still sleeping. Choose someone, yeah. Oh, I'll let you choose, Imran. Everyone is very secretive about their startup ideas. You're all working in stealth. Do you want to share?
Okay.
Sure, someone here wants to be brave. All right, what's your name? And you can share all the questions.
Hi, my name is Yao. And my product goal is basically to build an online marketplace with at least around 100,000 sellers because or rather retailers or F&B. And who's my product for again? It's for local producers and for the people who want to buy, for people who just want easy online access to the produce that's closest to them. And the advantage that my business might have is that we have a full-scale inventory management. For example, right now, you have Lazada, one of the biggest online marketplaces out there. But if I want to get stuff in the Tesco web store in Lazada, you don't have everything there. The reason is because inventory management for the real Tesco supermarket and the online Tesco is different. But because I work for StoreHub, iPad point of sale system, we already have a built-in inventory management for your regular store, and we can just import very easily to an online store. So we're trying to build a marketplace based on that. And our biggest challenge, I think, is just the idea of iPad point of sales. It's really new in Malaysia, very, very new. So to even make this work, you need to really scale, and you need to have a lot of sellers. And I guess it's a whole scaling thing.
It's a distribution problem, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing. See, that wasn't so scary. All right, are people mostly done with writing their answers? Yes, no? All right, well, let's move on. So you came to this workshop thinking you're going to learn user experience design. And I'm kind of curious, what do you guys think is quote-unquote user experience? Like, how would you define user experience? For example, what do you think user experience is? She said user experience is when she likes the product and she wants to use the product. Does someone else have a different definition of user experience? Very quiet crowd today. So anyway, I want to talk about user experience. What is user experience? And specifically, what is a good user experience? And to start, I want to open and I want to sort of hear from you guys. What experience do you love and why do you love it? So think of any positive experience you have. It doesn't have to be with a piece of software. It could be anything that you really love. You know, what is that experience and why do you love it? Does anybody have an experience they want to talk about, like an experience they love? Imran, where did he go? Imran, can you like just call on someone to answer? Yeah, you just have to think of one experience you really love and why. Oh, she has one. Oh, you can go first.
So I want to share about the kind of experience that I like is when the product is intuitive. When
Can you be specific? Like talk about a specific experience you really like.
This week I discovered the lorry.com.
Which one? Learning.com.
The lorry.com.
Okay.
And I found that their site is very easy to understand. Even for a first timer who came to their website, they easily understand how to use the service.
Okay. What were you trying to do on the site? What were you trying to do on the product? What was your goal?
It's a service to hire a lorry driver and stuff.
Okay. And so you found it very easy to accomplish your goal on this.
Very easy to understand.
Okay. All right, and you had one you wanted to share? Yeah, do you want to get the microphone?
I don't know if you guys have used the new Google app, but there's the Google Now function.
Yeah.
And you can actually like schedule appointments or add new tasks to do from the Google app. And then when you scroll up, you can actually see like weather and other news that might be useful to you based on your calendar app. I like it because they anticipate what you might need before you even think you need it, and they just have it there for you, and it's very.
So it's a good user experience because she doesn't have to think about it. It's already available before she even realizes that she needs it. All right, does anyone else have an experience they want to talk about? Doesn't have to be technology. It could be any experience that you really like.
Any medical experience?
When was the last time you were like really emotional about an experience you had?
Hello, this is still related to technology. Is it okay?
Yeah,
okay,
you can
so
pick one that's not.
My experience is getting hundreds likes in Facebook. Like when you when you post a photo to Facebook and get hundreds likes, it feels so awesome.
Yeah, why? Why does that feel awesome?
Yeah, because like you get a lot of recognition from your friends, from your relatives.
Okay.
So yeah, just feel your self-worthiness like increase so high.
So he likes when he gets a lot of likes on Facebook because it makes him feel really important. So that's a very important user experience. So I want to talk about some experiences that are generally considered good user experiences. For example, most people like to go on vacation. Why is going on vacation a good user experience? Why are you having a good experience here? Well, one, if you're on vacation, are you working very hard? Are you thinking very hard? No, you're relaxed, right? You're very relaxed. All you have to do is sip your margarita and hang out in your hammock. You usually go somewhere that's really beautiful, you're enjoying the scenery, you're not trying very hard. People have good experiences on vacation because it's novel, it's beautiful, and they're relaxed. They're not working hard. How many of you have ever driven a Ferrari? Has anyone here ever driven a Ferrari? No one. Who wants to drive a Ferrari? Who wants to drive a Ferrari? Almost all of you, right? Why do you want to drive a Ferrari? Speed. Why else do you want to drive a Ferrari? It's what? Because it's a Ferrari. Okay. You want to drive a Ferrari because, one, it gets you from point A to point B, right? It gets you there faster and smoother than any other car. And you do it in style, right? If you show up in a Ferrari, what do your friends think about you? You get social status, increased social status driving your Ferrari. That's why it's a good user experience. How many of you guys enjoy having dinner with your friends? Pretty much everyone, right? You enjoy, assuming you like these people. If you don't like these people, you're having a bad time. Like your relatives, maybe you don't want to have dinner with them. But almost everybody likes having dinner with their friends. Why? Because when you're eating, food is a physiological need. You have to accomplish this goal. And it's much more fun when you finish your goals or accomplish your goals with your friends, right? It's much more fun when you take photos and share them with your friends. So on the flip side, I want to talk about experiences that you hate. So, we talked about experiences we love. What are some experiences you guys just absolutely hate, just pisses you off every time? So someone in the back has, Imran? I think someone in the back has something they hate. Slow service in a restaurant. Why do you hate that? So he says, one, he hates slow service. Why do you hate slow service? Because you have a goal, you're trying to eat something, you're physiologically hungry, and you're being blocked from accomplishing your goal. And the other thing he hates is when the food comes really early for one person, and then it comes really late for someone else, and maybe it gets cold for the first person, or it's just really awkward to sit there and stare at someone while they eat. So he doesn't like it because it's socially awkward. What about other experiences? Who else hates something? When the internet is down. Why do you hate that? Why is that a bad experience? You cannot do your work. Yeah, so are you guys seeing a theme here? When do you have a bad user experience? You have a bad user experience when you want to do something and you can't, right? So let's talk about some experiences that are generally considered bad. Like I'm sure since you live close to Kuala Lumpur, you've had this experience, traffic jams, right? Why do traffic jams suck? Even if you're in your Ferrari, traffic jams suck. They're probably worse even when you're in your Ferrari. It's because you're trying to get somewhere, right? You're trying to go from point A to point B, and all of a sudden you can't. You can't get to point B, and there's nothing you can do about it. You don't know how to fix this problem. That's why it's a bad experience to be in a traffic jam. Now, if you think about it, it's not that different than when you have an issue with software, right? So a lot of you have probably used Windows, and you've seen this screen, which is the blue screen of death on Windows. It happens, you're just you think you're going from point A to point B, all of a sudden, boom. You can't go anywhere anymore, and you have no idea how to fix it. Let's look at another kind of user experience. What is this? It's what? It's complicated. Do you guys know what it is? It's a cockpit. It's an airplane cockpit. How does this user interface make you feel? Scared. How else does it make you feel? You're what? Confusing. It's confusing. It makes you scared. Do you want to pilot a plane? I'm afraid that if I piloted a plane, I would crash it. I have no idea how to use the controls. But just because a user experience is complex doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, right? The cockpit, interface, it's an expert system. So you're scared by it, but this guy, hopefully he knows what he's doing because he's had years of training using these kinds of interfaces. So there are some experiences that are just objectively bad, like nobody thinks traffic jams are good. And there are some interfaces that really, what helps a user think it's good or bad is their level of training and their expertise on your system. So I want to go back to the original question, what is user experience? This guy's Don Norman. He's one of the most famous designers of technology products. He's the founder of a really well-known design consultancy and also the author of a book that everyone should read called The Design of Everyday Things. And his definition of user experience is, user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its products, and its services. All aspects. So, when you come in as a designer and engineer, you may think of just your product. But the user experience with your company includes a lot of things that you may not have control over, such as your ad creatives and your marketing copy. How does a user discover your product? What is your brand reputation? If you roll in with a Ferrari, looks a lot different than you roll in with a Toyota. What about your server speed? As designers, a lot of times you don't want to worry about your server speed. You think it's an engineer's problem. However, your server speed, remember, if your internet's down, you don't have a good experience. Even if you have a beautiful app, internet's down, you're not going to have a good experience. Customer service and technical support. How many of you guys have ever had a bad customer service call? Really, not a good, everyone has had a bad customer service call. On the flip side, have you ever had a really amazing one? Like somebody was really, really attentive, really helped you with your problem. It really changed how you felt about their company. And also localization, does your product work well in one country versus another? Maybe people have different expectations. So lots of things go into what user experience is. So then you might be asking, well, look, I can't do all of these things. So, what do I focus on? So we're going to try to answer the question, what is UX design? And we're going to focus more on the product side today, but I want you to understand that user experience really is someone's interaction with your entire system. So when most people think of UX design, they think of something like this, right? They're like, oh, I'm going to design, I'm going to sketch my app, or maybe I'm going to use a tool like Balsamic, and I'm going to create all these screens, and I'm going to put the screens together. So a lot of times people think that that's UX design. And it's very important to do your interface design. But let me illustrate the difference between UX, UI, and how it relates to your product. So here's a picture of cereal, right? When you think of your product is all the different components of that cereal. Your bowl, your spoon, your milk, all the little grains of cereal. Your user interface is the piece that your user touches to interact with your product. So in this case, it'd be your spoon. The spoon, in this case, is your user interface. Your user experience is your whole cereal and the process of eating that cereal. But it's not just the cereal, right? It's also the experience around it. For example, how did someone find your cereal? What was the experience of purchasing your cereal? And what is the context in which it is being consumed? For example, is your cereal designed for families who want to have breakfast together in the mornings and family time cereal? Or is it for a busy professional who has no time, just wants to shovel food in his mouth and get out the door? Or is it cereal for romantic bonding and a way for couples to connect? Those are three completely different contexts, and you're going to have three different kinds of cereal that try to solve these user needs. So the challenge is when you think about just sketching interfaces, what you're basically doing is just designing a spoon. All you're thinking about is that user touch point between them and your product, but you're really missing that whole experience, the cereal, buying the cereal, the eating cereal with your lover, all that extra experience that adds to the value of a product. So I want to emphasize that UX design is not just interface and visual design. It's often seen as just oh, I'm going to sketch a bunch of mock-ups, I'm going to link them together, and that's my user experience design. It is important, but it's not the whole piece. So going back to Don Norman, talking more about what makes good user experience design. The first requirement of an exemplary user experience is to meet the exact needs of the user without fuss or bother. Earlier, we looked at a picture of a woman on a tropical vacation. When you're on a vacation, are you fussed? Are you bothered? Hopefully not, otherwise it's a bad vacation. So meeting the user experience, meeting the needs of the user without having the user having to work very hard to accomplish their goals. That's the first requirement of an exemplary user experience. Next comes simplicity and elegance that produce products that are a joy to own and a joy to use. Why is it that you'd rather drive a Ferrari than a Toyota? There's just this extra oomph that comes with driving that Ferrari, that, you know, the social proof, the style, the speed, all this extra stuff makes it a joy to use and a joy to own. Last point, very important. True user experience goes far beyond what customers say they want, basically goes far beyond giving customers what they say they want or providing a checklist of features. So Henry Ford, who's a famous American industrialist, he's known for inventing the first commercially viable car, the Model T. He has a very famous quote. He said, "If I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse." And that's because when you ask users what they want, they're not designers. They're not necessarily creative. So you have to think more than just what is the feature set of what you're providing in order to deliver a really good user experience. So the question is, how do you design an excellent user experience? And the answer is you have to go beyond the surface. So if you just do interface design, you're only maybe going to really change the spoon instead of the entire cereal experience. So design, I like to think about design in layers. So at the bottom, you have strategy, which is, you know, what is your business strategy? What is your product strategy? What do your stakeholders want in your business? And what do your users want? What kind of experience do they want? What kind of goals do they have? How do they want to get from point A to point B? The second layer is scope. As soon as you know what your strategy is, what are your requirements? What features, what experiences does your site need to have? Third layer is structure. How do all the different pieces of your product fit together? Fourth layer is skeleton. You know, what are the different components of your interface? And the final and fifth layer is, you know, your visual design, you know, your branding and that, your look and feel. So this particular image is in your worksheets. You can take a closer look if you want more details. But the way you think about it is, at the very bottom, you have your user needs and your product objectives. Second layer, you have functional specifications as well as your content requirements. Third layer, in structure, you have information architecture, interaction design. And then towards the top, you have interface design and visual design. So what happens is if you only do a couple pieces, like let's say you only do the visual design and just do the UI design, you'll tend to have an unhappy user. And it's even true, for example, if you kind of take these different pieces of design and you silo them. So sometimes in big enterprises, they have, you know, the user research team and then the graphic design team, and they don't talk to each other. That's almost as bad as just not having those functions at all. Instead, what usually happens is all of the different layers of design are constantly blending into each other. You're constantly iterating on all pieces of your design to create a really good user experience. Yes? There's going to be a recording, so you can review the recording. And then most of the essential information I put in your worksheets for you guys to take home. So anyway, so today I want to cover what we're going to go in depth. So first we're going to start with user research, which is covering the very bottom part. What are your product objectives? Who are you designing for? And how does that translate into functional requirements and content requirements? So user research. User research focuses on understanding user behaviors, needs and motivations through observation techniques, task analysis, and other feedback methodologies. And a quote that I like is, user research is about understanding the impact of a design on an audience. So the second subset of UX design we're going to talk about today is information architecture. This is a very uncommon term. Most people don't understand what information architecture means. Information architecture, however, is probably the most important piece of UX design, and we'll understand why today. Information architecture focuses on the organization of data. That is, how data is structured from a user's perspective, as opposed to the system or technical perspective. So when you think about the information architecture of a website or application, the IA determines what data is on each page and how the pages relate to each other. And then at the level of a page, it's about whether or not data is logically grouped and related. So to summarize, basically, information architecture is where you take data and content and you turn it into information. So the difference between data and information is data could be, for example, an Excel spreadsheet dump of a bunch of numbers. That's data. But when you take those numbers and you turn them into graphs or summaries or reports, that's information. Big difference between data and information. So let me give you some examples of common information architecture. For example, an encyclopedia system. if you're going to have an encyclopedia, it has a lot of information in it, and you have to organize and index this information in a usable way. So in this case, you have an encyclopedia that's organized by subject matter. But you can also have an encyclopedia organized alphabetically or by time. That is an example of an information architecture choice of how information has been organized. Another example is if you're a gigantic e-commerce site like Amazon, how are people going to find your products? You're going to need to have an organization and a categorization that allows people to figure out what they're going to buy and find it in an easy way. The third thing we're going to talk about is interaction design. Interaction design concerns the controls, mechanisms, and processes that a user requires to perform their task on systems and to meet their goals. So basically, interaction design is what I would call the quote-unquote design of affordances. An affordance is basically the aspect or the design of an object which communicates to you how that object is supposed to be used. So for example, how do you know when you go to a door whether you should push or pull? In this example, you push on one side because you can't do anything else. It's a flat panel. You're obviously supposed to push it. On the other side, you have a handle, so it's a little more obvious, like, okay, maybe I should pull this door. On the web and on mobile, affordances are things like buttons, drop-downs, radio buttons, checkboxes, slides. Those are all affordances. And interaction design is about the design of these affordances and also how you put them together to create an entire site or experience. And the last section we're going to talk about is usability engineering. Usability engineering consists of planning and executing various types of usability studies to test how well people can use a user interface and then make recommendations for how to correct the problems that the tests discover. So what usability engineering does is it does give you feedback on your entire system, but primarily it focuses on feedback for visual design and interface design because it's about people and their interaction with your interface. So to summarize, we're covering 4 sections of UX design today, which is user research, information architecture, interaction design, and usability engineering. But UX is a really big subject, as we discussed earlier, and I want to cover what we're not going to cover today too, so you just know what we're not going to be covering. So one, we're not going to cover business and product strategy. That by itself is a whole complex subject that could take another full-day workshop. And then we're also not going to cover visual design. That's another big subject. I am teaching a class in Kota Kinabalu on visual design that will be recorded. So if you want to get the basics of how do you make beautiful looking sites, you can go and find that recording after the talk has been done. But those 2 subjects we're just not going to cover today because we don't have the time. So now that you know 4 big sections of UX design, I should tell you a little bit more about how the UX design process works. So as we saw before, when you silo each design process, just like when you silo development away from marketing, you often have a bad result. The design process is usually a lot more iterative, and so it's very generally like this. First, you empathize. You learn about the audience that you're going to be designing for. Then you define, you figure out, what is your perspective? What is your angle on a particular problem and a particular audience? Then you ideate. You come up with a lot of different prototypes, ideas, sketches. And then you build them into interfaces that people can test and use. And this whole process is very iterative. So in the beginning, what you're doing is divergent thinking. You're increasing the number of ideas that you have. Because if you're going to design something, how do you know that you have the best solution? You only know if you've thought about the full landscape of what is possible. So in the beginning, the goal is to come up with many ideas, to do a lot of research, to understand a lot of different kinds of users, so that you can make an intelligent decision around when to optimize later. And the whole second half of this design process is convergent thinking. Now you're starting to be more evaluative. You have to think, okay, of these 10 prototypes or different angles, which one is going to be the best given our user goals, given our product goals? And again, to emphasize, it's not like you have an empathy phase, and then you go to a definition phase, and you go to an ideation phase. This whole process is very interrelated. You're constantly iterating through all these different modes of design, and you're constantly merging the different, the 4 different segments of user experience we're going to talk about today. So to make it a little bit more discrete, you're going to start generally, loosely, you're going to start with user research, go through requirements definition, create your information architecture, do your interaction design, and then when you have a product or a prototype, then you do your usability engineering. But it's not always this linear. Like I said, it's a very mixed process. It's very iterative. So let's start with user research. As we mentioned earlier, we talked about serial. And you might think serial, it seems like a pretty simple product, pretty straightforward. I don't know if I need to quote-unquote design serial. But if you think about it, there are a million different serials to select from. There are a lot of different people who consume serial. There are a lot of different angles on serial. There's actually quite a lot to think about even when you're doing a simple product like serial because there's a lot of competition. And when you're designing a serial, sometimes you think that your competition is just other cereals. But actually, there's a whole grocery store of products that people can eat for breakfast. And so in the case of designing software products, a lot of times people only think about their direct competitors, like another startup that is doing the exact same thing. Most of the time, your quote-unquote competitor is people's innate habit or the current workaround people are currently using, not necessarily another competitor. So when you think about designing serial in the competition, it kind of looks the same when you think about mobile. You have one mobile app, and there's so many other mobile apps. If you were at my talk last night, we talked about how there's 2.5 million apps right now on the iOS and Android app stores, and people generally only focus on 8. They can only regularly use 8, and they use maybe 4 on a daily basis. And again, you might think, oh, my competition is other apps. But not necessarily, because there's a million other things that capture attention. At the end of the day, a person has 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, 356 days in a year. So there's only so much time and capacity and brain power they can allocate to anything, whether it's your app, whether it's a serial, whether it is something else. So it's very, very important, if you want to be successful, to basically make something people want. This is the number one piece of advice that Paul Graham has. Paul Graham is the founder of Y Combinator, probably the most successful startup incubator in the world. Because he discovered, looking at so many companies going through his incubator, he found that what is the most common cause of product failure? It's never because somebody couldn't build a product. Usually that doesn't happen. Usually building a product is the easy part. What happens is, no one wants it. You build it, no one uses it. It's lack of traction that usually is the reason why startups fail. And I have a theory on why, and I call it the mind projection fallacy. So the mind projection fallacy is the assumption that our subjective judgments reflect intrinsic qualities of objects or reality in general. So let's say you don't like broccoli. Like broccoli, I don't like broccoli, therefore broccoli is yucky. So you think broccoli has this inherent quality of being yucky, when it is really just a subjective filter. And one effect of this is that we assume that other people think the same way we do. So we're like, oh, we really like to download new mobile apps, and we really like to try new things. Therefore, other people should want to use our app too, right? But the thing is, entrepreneurs are super weird. So we go to design a cereal, and we're like, dude, I want some cereal with like blue marshmallow squares, and I want sprinkles in my cereal, and I just want like all this weird stuff, weird shiny stuff in my cereal. And the problem is a lot of times entrepreneurs have a hard time connecting with real people. You don't understand, why somebody, would have a romantic experience with their cereal. It's just difficult for people to understand sometimes. So user research basically is, it's also called customer development. And then the main sort of motto behind user research is get out of the building. And you may have heard this because Steve Blank, Eric Ries, and a lot of the lean startup guys say it all the time, which is you're not going to design successfully if you're just sitting in front of your computer coding. Because you clearly have, you don't understand your user very well if that's the only thing that you're doing. The whole point of user research is it helps you fill gaps in your knowledge through systematic investigation of how and why people use technology. So there's a lot of benefits for doing user research. For example, you can gain empathy and insights. You better understand people's needs. You can define and prioritize functionality, and you can also improve usability. So it sounds like user research is really awesome, but why is it that so many people don't do it? Like a lot of people, this is how they feel about user research. They're like, I did user research once, and it was horrible. I hated it. And there's a lot of reasons why people are just like very against user research, and here are a few of them. One is I don't have access to users. I'm sitting in my startup co-working space with my computer, and oh, it's just so difficult to talk to users. The problem is if you can't acquire users now, then you're not going to acquire them when you have your product either. So learning how to reach out to users is a skill you want to develop even before you start to build anything. Another complaint is, well, I already know what users want. Again, mind projection fallacy. You think that other people want what you want. Given the fact that 90% of products fail, that is clearly not the case. Like clearly, what you think people want is generally not what they want. Third concern, it's too time consuming. Oh, I'm busy writing code here. I don't want to go off and have to talk to some users. I think it's too time consuming. You know what else is time consuming? Failing. Failing is time consuming. Spending a lot of time building a product that nobody wants is time consuming. Talking to users is awkward. It's totally awkward. Talking to users is so awkward. It's true. You have to learn to live with it because they're going to be your primary source of information. So this is, I think, a fair complaint. And we can talk about some strategies later about how to make it less awkward. User research is expensive. It is sometimes expensive because sometimes you need to recruit a very specific kind of user. You need to compensate for them for their time if they come in to test your product or if they come in for informational interviews. It can get expensive, but you know what else is expensive? Failure. Raising a lot of money, building a product, and then having nobody use it. That's more expensive than your user research will be. And the last thing, they don't like my idea. This is really funny because a lot of times entrepreneurs will talk to users and then they'll stop talking to users because they're not getting great feedback and they'll kind of just ignore what the user said because they don't want to admit that their idea is not that great or there's something a little bit wrong. This happens so often, but it's really funny because if users don't like your idea right now, they're not going to like it when you've launched it either. Probably. They're probably not going to like it when you launch it either. So these are all common concerns, but none of them are very valid for not doing user research. Another way to think about why you should invest in user research is that when you first start a project and your project definition is very open, the number of design possibilities is very high. But as you become more convergent, right, as you do more convergent design, going through your implementation, going to launch, the number of design alternatives shoots down, and the cost to change your mind is extremely high. So if you do your research too late, a lot of times you have a sunk cost, you've already built a product, you're a lot biased against changing, and it ends up costing you in the long run when you could have just invested in earlier ideation. So user research should be really fun, it shouldn't be painful. It is actually my favorite part of the design process. So I'm going to talk about different user research methods and hopefully get you guys a little bit more excited about doing user research. So generally, when you're doing research, you go through these loose steps. First, you have your objectives. What do you want to know, and why? And then your hypotheses. What are you assuming? What do you believe about your users currently? It's actually a good thing to state because usually they're wrong. So when you state them, you can see later on as you learn how wrong you really were. Third is methods. How do you plan to learn? We're going to discuss these in greater detail later. Fourth is research. Gathering information and knowledge, and finally it's synthesis, which is understanding where the opportunities and where the problems are. So research comes in kind of 4 different flavors, and they become increasingly more convergent. The first one is generative and explorative research. So this is what you do in very early phases, and you're basically answering the question, what is possible? You're very open-ended, talking to all kinds of users, thinking about all kinds of ideas, just trying to figure out what is the landscape of possibility. The next phase is descriptive and explanatory research. So that's where you kind of dig a little bit deeper on any particular ideas and you say, well, how do these various ideas work? I just want to learn how these different implementations manifest themselves in my users. Third is evaluative, which is, let's say you have a short list now. You've done a lot of exploratory research. You kind of understand how they work. Now you have 10 ideas you think are pretty decent. Which one is the best? That's where you test them to see which one you should do. And then finally, observational and reflective research, which is, okay, you committed to an idea. How well is it really working? Today we're going to cover a bunch of different user research methods. You have a copy of this in your handout as well, so you can refer to them as we go along. And they fall across a pretty wide range of types. So you have research methods that are more quantitative versus qualitative. So like A/B testing is very qualitative versus behavioral and attitudinal. So behavioral is like what people actually do. Attitudinal is how people think and feel. So So A/B testing is very quantitative. It's also very behavioral. Versus, say, interviews tend to be more qualitative. They tend to be more attitudinal. You can also think of user research methods in terms of the type of research you're doing. So if you're doing more generative research, you're trying to answer what is possible, then you might do things like user interviews or contextual inquiries, and we'll talk more about those later. Or if you're actually in a phase where you're trying to test which idea is best, you're going to use other user research methods. So the main thing that you want to focus on when you're thinking about your user research plan is it's called user research, not just research. So bad recruiting equals bad research. So if you're trying to do user research and you're really lazy, right? You kind of think, oh, it's too time consuming, it's too expensive. I'm just going to get up from my desk, walk over and talk to the other founder over there, because I'm doing user research. The problem with that is if he's not your target user, you're not going to get the greatest data. If you want to do real user research, you have to go and find the actual potential users of your platform. You can't just talk to your Facebook friends and tell yourself that you did user research. So strategies for recruiting users. I want to talk about that to make the process a little bit easier. The first thing you need to do is you need to define your criteria and write a screener. So a screener is a very, very short survey that tests whether or not somebody fits your profile. For example, let's say you're building an app and it's for fitness enthusiasts, people who are really hardcore at working out. You might have a screener that asks, hey, how often do you go to the gym? Because if a guy goes to the gym, 4 times a year, they're not going to be a very good user of your product. So a screener is just a very simple, should be short, basically list of requirements that tests whether a user does or does not fit your profile. Second thing is to go to their environments. Let's say you're developing a shopping app and you want to recruit users, maybe go to the mall and start talking to people there. Or if you could go on forums where people talk about shopping and shopping deals and see what people are saying and interact with people there. Third thing you could do is you can target people with advertisements and marketing. So you can have a survey, like a screener survey. You could run a Facebook ad against your screener survey with the exact demographic targeting you need. And then based on people's responses to the screener survey, you'll select users. And you do often have to compensate people because people are generally not on the internet looking to fill out random surveys for startups. So it does cost a little bit of money sometimes to do this kind of targeted recruiting. But if it costs you $500 and you recruit 10 really, really, really good users, that's better than if you did nothing at all. Or if you spent that $500 on something that's a little bit later stage that doesn't actually help your design. Fourth thing is to leverage your networks and customer base. So a lot of times, entrepreneurs are already in the space that they're working in. If you're in shipping and logistics, you came from that background. Or if you're in medicine, you came from that background. In that case, you want to leverage your existing networks and your customer base. Just ask them more aggressively to refer you to other users. And the final thing is using a user recruiting agency. So there are a lot of these. I don't personally recommend it. I think that if you were an entrepreneur, you should learn how to recruit your own users because that teaches you how to do your distribution later. You're going to start to understand where are people going, what are the hubs of activity for your particular domain. But a lot of big companies who don't have a user research internal department will sometimes use user research recruiting agencies. So it is an option. They are expensive though, So going back to user research methods, I'm going to basically go one by one and talk about them. So the first thing is surveys. Surveys are really easy to build and launch because all you're doing is listing a bunch of questions and having your users fill them out. But surveys have problems, right? So the first problem with surveys is, one, you're asking people to reflect on something using their own memory. So a lot of times you have a survey, you say, hey, how often do you go to the gym? The user's like, oh yeah, I go to the gym all the time. I go there like 3-4 times a week. They don't go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. They go like maybe once a week. So they're totally kind of exaggerating a little bit. And then sometimes you have a survey about an experience, but there's been some time since that experience occurred. So you're kind of relying on people's memory. In general, relying on self-reporting is not the greatest way to get objective data because people are very biased, their memories are very flawed. So one way to fix this incrementally is if you did what's called an intercept survey. So an intercept survey is when you send the survey to the user at the exact moment when they perform an activity you want to learn about. So let's say you have a shopping app. Right? You want to know, how do customers feel after they make a purchase? What you might do is just wait outside of a store with an intercept survey and a gift certificate and stop people and say, hey, will you fill out my survey for like this $5 gift certificate? You can also do this online. So a lot of times you'll see like random pop-ups when you're using a product that says, hey, you know, how did you feel about this experience, yada, yada, yada. Those are intercept surveys that are trying to get you to report your feelings and your observations in the moment of having an experience. So another method of user research is what's called a diary study. It's basically just logging, daily logging. Why is this better than a survey sometimes? Well, if you want to track how often someone went to the gym, you can either wait for them to report to you, which will probably be over-reported, or you can just have them log every time they go to the gym. That way you know, okay, this person was at the gym 2 times this week, not 3 to 4 times this week, like he said in the survey. So it is beneficial to run diary studies depending on the kind of information you need. That said, you know, sometimes just logging a behavior changes it, right? Maybe if I wasn't logging, if I didn't know someone was going to look at my gym history, maybe if I'm tired on a certain morning, I won't go to the gym. But now that I'm logging it, people are looking at my record, maybe I'll do it more. So just recording activity sometimes changes behavior. So just be a little bit mindful of that when you do diary studies. Card sorting. Earlier we talked about, you know, Amazon and their giant catalog of products. If you have a lot of information on your site, you want to make sure it's organized in a way that your users understand, not just organized in a way that you think should be understood. And one way to test this is what's called card sorting. So with card sorting is you have a bunch of different like items on cards, and then you tell users, hey, organize these however you see fit, or create labels, or like maybe you pre-create labels and you see where people put things. Do they put them under shoes, or do they put them under boots, or do they put them under whatever? And so card sorting is very important for sites that have a lot of content to make sure that, you know, your navigational structure fits the mental model of your user. Another research method is participatory design. That's where you actually bring the user in and you have them do design with you. And this can be really fun because everybody loves to design. Design is very fun. And it can be a little bit more creative than just asking your user to fill out a survey. Another thing you can do is focus groups, which is where you get a set of customers or potential customers, you get them into a room talking to each other about the problem space, their concerns. Because that collaborative discussion helps people come up with way more ideas than if you just had them report their ideas on their own. Another thing you can do is paper prototyping. So sometimes, you know, you just want to iterate on an interface, or you just want to get really quick feedback on how people feel about using a particular app in a context. So you could sketch something out really quickly and then test it with people. So for example, there are index cards on your tables. You may use them later for just sketching mobile app screens. And so what I found is very useful is you can basically make a fake paper prototype with index cards, wait in line at a coffee shop, ask someone to test an app, and see if they can finish a task before they get to the register. So you can start to test lots of little things with just simple paper prototypes. Another thing you can do is usability studies, which is just studying how people are using existing products. You don't have to have a fully working product to do usability studies. You can, for example, you could test your competitors. If you have a lot of competitors, like if you're trying to build a new social photo sharing app, you should probably do usability studies on the existing ones to understand where the problems are. But you can also do usability tests on, you know, partial prototypes or even paper prototypes. So there's really no excuse to not be studying how people are using your interface early on in a design phase. Another method in user research is data and analytics. Obviously, to do this, you probably already have some kind of product that is generating data, either a working prototype or a live product. But you get a lot of information based on how people are using your product currently. But the main bulk of user research is what I would call ethnographic studies. That's where you play anthropologist, and you go and you talk to and you observe people in their quote-unquote natural habitat. So for example, you may do in-home interviews. Like maybe you're designing an app for mothers. And you really need to understand the environment in which mothers are operating, because they're not sitting in an office like most people. They have all these things going on, and you want to understand what are the distractions, what are the handicaps, what are the issues with that environment. And so you're going to want to do an in-home interview. You can also call these kind of field research, field interviews, contextual inquiries. That's what they're commonly called. So for example, if you're designing an enterprise product that's going to be used by a team, you're going to want to go to the office, look at how the team is working, see who is communicating with who is interacting with the software in what capacity, and what are the distractions in the environment. That's very important for you to understand. If you're designing, like I said, a shopping app or some kind of app that's used physically when somebody moves around, you're going to want to do a follow me around. You're going to want to see, like, okay, this person, this is how she shops. This is what she's holding in her hands. This is like what she looks at. This is how she makes decisions on the fly. Because your app is going to be used in the context of her making purchasing decisions physically in a mall. And then there's user interviews. This is probably the bulk of what you're going to be doing for your user research. This is basically where after you recruit users that fit your screener, that fit your profile, you sit them down, you ask them questions about their attitudes. So you don't have to do this in your office. You can also just go out and interview people in more casual places, or also just in the context of their environment. Now often, user interviews, you have to be kind of careful about how they're conducted. For example, this is a really common scenario in user interviews. So this is Dilbert, a comic. This guy loves to make fun of software development. So in this scenario, Alice is saying, hey, I'll need to know your requirements before I start to design the software. First of all, what are you trying to accomplish? The guy's like, I'm trying to make you design my software. She's like, well, I mean, what are you trying to accomplish with the software? He's like, well, I don't know what I can accomplish until you tell me what the software can do. And she's like, well, try to get this concept through your thick skull. The software can do whatever I design it to do. And he says, well, can you design it to tell you my requirements? And so what is the problem here? She can what? Well, the main problem here is she's asking the user, hey, I'm designing your software. What features do you want? What do you want the software to be designed like? It's a common mistake to ask your user to design your software for you, right? So it's very common to do that, and it ends up, if you make these mistakes, a lot of times you end up asking your users to design the product for you, which you shouldn't because they're not designers. You're the designer. So one common mistake is asking leading or closed questions. Hey, do you like shopping at Walmart? Or isn't shopping at Walmart awesome? Like, those are leading questions that have a yes or no answer. If he says yes or no, what are you going to do about it? Is shopping at Walmart awesome? Yes. OK, well, what are you going to do about that? Another problem is focusing on product instead of problem. So a lot of times in user interviews, you want to show the user your app. You're like, hey, what do you think about this app? Isn't it great? Well, that doesn't really help you understand how the user is behaving or thinking. All that does is focus you on the product. And then the third thing is, hey, making the user do your job. How useful is this feature? Hopefully, you should have a sense of how useful a feature is looking at other behavioral data or observing your user. So what should you do instead when you're doing user interviews? You should keep your questions very open-ended. So you ask who, what, where, when, how. And you ask these about how the user behaves. You don't ask them about your product. In fact, I actually recommend in user interviews, you don't talk about your product at all. So when you recruit for users to research, you'll say, hey, we're doing a study about how middle-aged women in Malaysia do their shopping. You don't say, hey, we want your feedback on an app that we're designing. You say, we're researching this behavior. And so you don't precondition the user to think of a specific product. And then you want to make sure you ask why. You want to ask why. You want to keep asking why until you can no longer get like any additional information. So for example, you want to do research on how people approach social networks. So you might say, hey, why do you spend time on Facebook? Well, I like staying in touch with friends. Why do you stay in touch with friends? Well, it keeps our relationship warm. Why are warm relationships important? Well, I feel much closer and open to people I interact with on a frequent basis. You're just getting more detailed information about how a person feels about a problem when you keep asking why. Because you might get very different answers depending on how deep you go, right? So why do you spend time on Facebook? Well, I enjoy looking at my friends' photos and posts. Okay, why are you motivated to look at them? Well, they're often funny and interesting, and I get a laugh out of it. Well, why do they need to be funny or interesting? Well, I feel like I'm not wasting time if I'm at least entertained. So there's a lot that you can get if you keep asking why. So when you think about conducting an interview, it usually follows this kind of time scale. So first you want to introduce yourself, and you want to introduce your project. And like I said, generally speaking, you don't want to lead the user and say, oh, we're doing a study about this mobile app that lets you do X, Y, Z. Because then they're going to think of things in the context of your app. What you really want to understand is what are they doing in their natural environment? What are their behaviors and their attitudes? And so you might just want to say, hey, we're doing a mobile app, or you might want to just say, hey, we're doing a study about how people go around doing X, Y, Z. What kind of tools and processes do you use? What kind of struggles and frustrations do you have? And you want to make sure you get them telling stories. You shouldn't be talking more than 10% of the time. If you find yourself talking about your product, you control yourself. Tell yourself not to talk anymore. You want to have people tell stories, be specific, and you really want to explore emotions, because emotions are where people are really either experiencing big problems, experiencing a lot of pleasure. That's really what you want to understand. So when you conduct interviews, there's a bunch of things you want to look for. You want to be able to articulate this at the end of a user interview. It's like, what are their beliefs? What are their values? What are their goals and motivations? Additionally, regarding a particular problem space, what are their expectations? What are the triggers that cause them to take action or be inactive? What are their native behaviors, and which of their behaviors are so practiced that they've become habits? What are their pain points, and what are the emotions? So these are all things that you want to look for in interviews. You want to make sure that you ask open-ended questions and elicit stories and specifics so that you get at these truths. So we're going to do another exercise now. We're going to create a user research plan. So it's in your worksheet. You have this open. It's basically a few components of a user research plan. First is context, which is what is your business problem? You should have written what your business challenge was before and what your business goals are. But you may want to think about, like, okay, in my business, there may be something I don't really understand about my user, and that's where I want to focus my research on first. What's your objective? What are your questions about your business, about your product, about your users, and where are your knowledge gaps? And then your audience. What is the demographic and psychographic profile of your audience? What is your screener going to look like for filtering out users that are appropriate? Locations. Where are you going to recruit users? And then where is your research going to be conducted? Methods. What are your processes and what are your questions? I would encourage you to start writing a list of the kinds of questions, open-ended questions, that you're going to be asking your users. And then schedule. When are you going to do this? And finally, with outcomes, we're going to talk about those later, so we're not going to worry about that particular entry now. So you can work, if you came here with your co-founder, just work with your co-founder. If you're by yourself, just fill it out on your own. Most of you have more or less finished your user research plans. The whole goal of these plans is to help you organize your own research. So, with your context, you really want to understand what is your biggest business risk. You really want to understand, for example, if you're designing mobile games and you want them to be successful, you may want to ask users, well, hey, your biggest business problem is that you have so much competition. Right? So you may want to figure out what games people already like so you can build more games like them. So then your objectives would be, okay, figure out what kind of games people like the most, where are they finding these games, where are they playing the games, how long do they keep playing the game before they stop, and a lot of these other contextual information about how people are making decisions around gaming so that you can then design your game to fit their needs. So we've covered in this user research plan your context, objectives, audiences, locations, methods, and schedule. And this is all for just you to organize your own research efforts. And now now I want to talk about outcomes, because basically, let's say you created this plan and you conducted your user research. So we don't have time to conduct user research in this workshop, but after you've collected a lot of data, information, you've done all your methodologies, your question is, well, now what? Okay, I did all my user research, I have all this data, what do I do now? So what you could do is, you could put all your research together in a summary and a report, but nobody really likes reading long research reports. One thing that designers do to make it a little bit more interesting is they take each insight, so they'll look through a report or they'll look through an interview, and then each notable insight they'll write on one post-it note and then post it up. And that way it just makes it a lot easier to organize your information. But basically, once you're done with your user research, or you have some insights you have from user research, what you're basically doing is you're taking all the data and all that content and organizing it into information. That should sound familiar. That should sound like what information architecture is, which is basically when you take data and content and you turn it into information. So now I'm going to talk about, once you're done with your user research, you've investigated how your users behave, you've gone to their environments, you have a better understanding of how they think about technology, how they think about competitors in your space. Now you want to organize it in a way that's useful for you and for them. So one of the most popular information architecture deliverables is what's called personas. What a persona is, it's basically, you may interview 100 users, or maybe 200 users, or maybe more, and you're going to notice patterns, different kinds of users with different kinds of behavioral patterns. And what you do is, in a persona, you kind of take your research and you figure out the average person, the average archetype, and then you make that archetype very rich. And then whenever you design your product, you think about what that person would do. So for example, we looked at a bunch of different people who might eat cereal, right? And so all of these people have different reasons for eating cereal, different concerns, different issues. And so in a persona, you're going to want to include information like, okay, what is the person's basic profile? What kind of personality do they have? What are they being influenced by? How do they make decisions? What are their motivations? I spelled archetype wrong. What's their technology experience? If you're building technology products, you want to know how people behave with current technology. What are their knowledge? What's their knowledge of the space? And what are their do's and don'ts? So for example, let's look at Abby, okay? Abby is a stay-at-home mother of 3. She's a part-time yoga instructor. She's also a really active community member. She's busy, she's health conscious, she's family oriented. Her goals when it comes to cereal and breakfast, she really wants to spend quality time with her family. She wants to get everyone out the door efficiently in the morning. She wants to stay healthy, she wants to stay under budget. And her pain points when it comes to breakfast time and making decisions about cereal is, one, it's really difficult to satisfy different tastes. She has 3 kids and a husband, and they all like different kinds of cereal, and it's kind of hard to make them happy in the morning. Another pain point is she has no time in the morning to prepare meals. Everyone's really busy, everyone has to get out the door. Another pain point she has is, there are a lot of breakfast options, but they're all really unhealthy. Like they're really sugary or they're really fattening. And then, feeding 3 kids and a husband can get really expensive. So this is just kind of like a very lightweight persona based on presumably a lot of research. If you're designing cereal, you talk to a lot of different people, you find that one archetype, one common pattern you see is mothers trying to feed their children. And this persona is a way to aggregate this research into kind of like a real, like a sort of a simulated person. And another thing you could do is scenarios and storyboards. So what a storyboard is where you sketch out and you describe the exact process by which someone experiences your product or solves a problem. So for example, you might sketch out, the alarm going off, and then Abby wakes up, and she goes to the kitchen, and she starts to prepare meals. And then her husband wakes up, and he comes out first, and she makes pancakes for him because he doesn't like cereal. And then it's time to wake the kids. And so the point is that the point of storyboarding is that you really want to deeply understand that whole experience that goes around your product, and you want to sketch it out because it's a more creative experience. So you don't have to worry about, being a great artist because no one's going to judge you for your artistic ability. It's more like, does your storyboard cover that experience that someone is having? So we're going to do an exercise. We're going to make personas, and we're going to sketch out storyboards. So you can do this for your own product, or you can do it for an idea. And if you don't have an idea, then pick one of the cereal people and make a persona for them. Like, who is this guy? Why is he consuming cereal? Who are these people? Why are they consuming cereal? So if you don't have your own product and you don't have an idea, do one of the cereal people for this exercise. But if you do have a product or a prototype or an idea, then what I want you to do is go to the persona page in your workbook and think about, I mean, ideally you do this after you've done a lot of user research, where you have a lot of different patterns, but we're just going to go through the exercise of filling it out. So kind of imagine who are the kind of people who are going to use your product and fill out this persona for them. And then you also have 3 pages of storyboard. So I want you to start sketching out who, your core user and what their experience might look like working with your product. Or you can also storyboard what their current experience looks like without your product, because that helps you understand a little bit better their full experience. So we spent the morning learning about user research, and it's the first part of user experience design. You want to make sure you do that before you do any other kind of the design process. So we went through exercises where we did personas for our products, and some of you got to complete your storyboards as well. So now we're going to move on. So you have all these other insights and learnings, right? And we learned that personas is one way to take your research and turn it into a format that's useful for your design. But there's a lot of other things you can do when you have all these different insights. For example, you can take a lot of the insights that you got. We talked about how instead of creating like a summary or report, what you do is when you have a lot of user research, you can write one insight per post-it note and then put it up on a wall to help you organize. So what you can do with that is you create what's called a concept map, which is where you take all your different insights and you group them together based on patterns that you see. Another thing that you can do is create mind maps, which is figuring out what concepts relate to what other concepts, maybe what the hierarchies are. So those are pretty common. You do this even in other kinds of business activities. The next deliverable you can make is what's called a gap analysis, also called a mental model. So the purpose of doing this is to figure out where the gaps are between what users are trying to do and what solutions exist that help them accomplish those goals. So the way you make a mind map, a gap analysis or a mental model is this. You draw a line, and at the top you stack all the user's intentions, and on the bottom you stack all the solutions that meet that particular intention. And then you break it down by step. So let's go through a really, really simple gap analysis. So this is a gap analysis that studies the gap between goals and solutions when it comes to waking up in the morning, right? So for example, you see, one of my goals is to get out of bed. One of my, some solutions might be an alarm clock, batteries, my mobile phone. Then I want to wash up. The solutions I use are soap, toiletries, all this other stuff. Brushing teeth, well, I use my toothbrush and my toothpaste. So the point is that you put all of the goals, the needs, the questions on top, and then the existing solutions, or what people do, on the bottom. So let's look at another example. This is a gap analysis for a working adult that's looking for financial aid. So on the top is all the needs and the questions, like how do I apply, what kind of different kinds of financial aid is there, just understanding basic financial aid. So those are all the questions they have, and at the bottom, they have possible solutions, right? They could chat with a counselor, they could visit the website, they could do read a particular article. And so you see that at the top, you put all of the questions, all of the concerns, and then the bottom is all the solutions that people have for addressing them. And so you can do these, with a flow diagram software, or you can just do it with your Post-it notes. So a lot of times what I do is, having written all my insights out, I then organize it in this gap analysis where above the line is everything a user is trying to do, and then below the line is where their solution. So you can immediately see, for example, there are a bunch of columns where the user is trying to do something and there exists no solution for that intention. And so that particular organization of your data helps you see where the mismatch is between users' goals and users' needs and solutions that actually address them. So that when you're thinking about product functionality for your user, for your personas, this helps you figure out what functionality might be most urgent, because that's the functionality they cannot currently fix in their current solution set. So this is, again, examples of mental models and what's also called a gap analysis. I personally prefer to use the word gap analysis because the term mental model also has a different definition, which I'm going to go over now. And the different definition of mental model is basically what a user believes about a system and how it works. So no matter what kind of product you're designing, there's always 3 different kinds of models. One is the concept model, the mental model, and then the system model. And the way you think about it is the concept model is the designer's model for a particular product and how it works. The mental model is how a user thinks a product works. And then the system model is how it's actually implemented, or the engineer's model for how it works. And most of the time, there's a mismatch between these different models. How you want the software to be presented is different than what the user's preconceptions are, is completely different than how the engineer implemented the software. So let me go through a couple examples. One is air conditioning. Air conditioning seems pretty simple, right? Like if you want a room to be cold, you turn it on. But what happens a lot is you walk into a room that's really hot, and then what people usually do is they turn the air conditioning up to the maximum because they think, to like maximum like low temperature, because they think, well, the lower it goes, the faster it cools, right? So you walk in, let's say it's, I don't know Celsius degrees, but let's say it's, it's really hot, it's like 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and you turn it all the way down to the lowest setting at 50 degrees Fahrenheit because you think it's going to cool faster. Now the problem is that the way air conditioner systems are implemented is it's a linear rate, right? So it cools at the same rate regardless of where you set the temperature. And so there's a mismatch between how the system is implemented and how users think it works, right? So users think, if I make the temperature gap more extreme, it's going to cool faster, it's going to blow harder, right? No, it blows at the exact same linear output regardless of where you put the temperature. So when you set the temperature too low, you're just guaranteed to overshoot your target temperature. Right? So that's an example of mental model doesn't really fit the system model. And there's tons of examples. Most of the time, the way software is implemented has nothing to do with how a user thinks it's being structured. And so the purpose of a designer, and your goal as a designer, is to take a concept model that helps bridge the user's mental model with the actual system model of how a product works. So let's go through a different example. For a long time, the only way you could interact with computers is through a command line interface. So you had to type in commands to get the computer to do anything. Most people have no idea how to use a command line interface. It doesn't, it's a complete system model. It doesn't do very much for helping users who don't understand how computers work. But when computers first came out, they were meant to be an office tool to make you more productive. People understand, at the office, I have a desk, I have folders, and I have documents inside my folders, which is why most computer interfaces now look like this, right? They take a well-known mental model, which is I have an office, I have a desk, I have folders, and I put documents in my folders. I understand this concept. And that's how a lot of times the interface of an operating system is structured, is, oh, I have documents, and I put them in folders. This has nothing to do with how it's implemented underneath the hood. Like the code isn't like, oh my God, your photo is now in this folder as like the way it's being stored, but users understand this model, so it's helpful. That said, this model, even though it tries to simplify for users, there's still people who don't really get it. Like, how many of you have ever helped an older person, like your grandma, try to use technology? Have any of you tried to help, like, older people use technology? How is that usually? They just don't get it, right? Like, open your window, but it's already cold in here. So they really just don't understand, even with this simplified mental model, how things work. So for example, whenever I work with my mom on a computer, she freaks out every time I minimize a window. Because she doesn't understand that just because the window has disappeared doesn't mean that I lost the information. She just thinks, oh, if it's not there, it's gone, right? So that's her model. And so as a designer, you can do little things to try to fix that. For example, on Mac OS X, when you go to minimize a window, or when you go to close a window, it completely disappears. When you minimize the window, it kind of does this like, and it kind of shrinks, and it kind of goes to this little corner. So instead of it disappearing, it's trying to communicate to the user, hey, I'm not disappearing, all I'm doing is hiding over here. So it tries to communicate to the user, I'm minimizing, I'm not disappearing. Another example is this. So iPad is considered to be a very intuitive interface, right? Why? The system model for an iPad is very complex. It's a very complex system to implement, this sensitive touchscreen interface. But what do people understand? People understand how to use books. People have used books for thousands of years, ever since paper and writing were invented. So in this particular case, what the designers did for the iPad is they took a mental model they know people understand, which is, okay, I understand how to use books. I got it. I can flip pages. And they used that as a concept to connect the mental model, which is the user's understanding of the world, with the system model, which is the actual way something is engineered. Very rarely are you ever going to have a mental model that matches a system model. Even if you are an engineer, you're not necessarily going to know how the iPad is being implemented on the back end. So it's up to the designer to connect mental model with system model. So there's basically two definitions of mental model. One is the gap analysis we talked about, and that's why I prefer the word gap analysis. But that kind of study is also called mental model, but you have to make sure you differentiate between the gap analysis and this more common definition of mental model, which is the user's model of a system, as distinguished from the designer's model of a system, as distinguished from an engineer's model of the system. So next I want to talk about taxonomy and metadata. So taxonomy is basically a method of classification. And you probably learned about it when you studied biology in high school, and you learned about how animals are classified based on their features. In the same way, on a website, especially if you have a lot of content, you're going to have to classify your information. If you have, for example, an e-commerce store that sells bikes, you're going to want to know, okay, well, how am I going to classify things? I'm going to have bikes, and under bikes, there's going to be kinds of bikes, and then accessories and kinds of accessories. Having the correct taxonomy matters a lot when you have heavy media or heavy content. For example, let's say you're Netflix. How are people going to find movies that they want? Well, if they don't know the specific title of a movie, then they're just browsing, right? So how you set your categories changes how people can find content. And if you're a company like Netflix, you want people to watch as many movies as possible. But they're not going to watch a lot of movies if they can't find content that they want, which is why your classification scheme is very important for helping your users navigate your site. So let's do another example. Zappos. If I look up women's boots on Zappos, there are 6,257 possible boots I could buy. How am I going to find the boot that I want? In this particular case, Zappos uses a lot of metadata. What do I mean by metadata? Obviously, on the side, you have size, width, styles, and there's actually 16 more filters you can use on Zappos to find the boot that you want. There is, boot shaft, heel height, color, occasion, brand, price, materials, theme, shaft circumference, shaft height, accents, pattern, and heel style. So for every boot, they have collected all this metadata around classifications, ways to classify this boot, and this does help me as a user figure out exactly which boot I want out of the 6,257 boots I could possibly buy on Zappos. So if your site is very information heavy, you're going to need to make sure that you have the right taxonomy and that you have a lot of metadata around the content so that users can actually find it. But whether you have a lot of content or not, you're going to want to also make sure that you understand your object model. So this is a very, very oversimplified example, but most products will have a user, right? And you want to know what are the attributes of a user and what are the elements of a user. For example, a user usually has an ID, a name, a location, maybe a photo, a rank if you're a social game, and some other characteristics. And then maybe a user also has an activity stream or a list of friends or a collection of photos. These are all attributes or elements of users. You may also have photos. What are the attributes and elements of photos? So a photo has a title, has a description, has tags, has a creator, has a date created. Now, a lot of people don't do this, but what happens when you go to design your UI? Let's say you're about to design a user profile page, and you don't understand your object model. You don't understand what attributes a user has. What's going to happen? You're going to design a wireframe that doesn't actually cover or doesn't accommodate all the information related to a user. And so it's very important to, whether you have a complex site or not, to understand what are the different objects in my site and what are the different elements and attributes per object type. So another information architecture strategy is content inventory. So a content inventory is very important when you are redesigning an existing site. So let's say you have, you're trying to redesign Netflix. How can you redesign Netflix if you don't understand what's on Netflix already? So content inventory is where you systematically go and you look at every single page, every single element, every single item on a website, and you methodically map out, what is the title, what is the location, what is the type, what is the all this other necessary metadata, because that way you can understand, here's all the kind of information I have on the site or that I need for a type of site. Now I can think about how to better organize it. So another method for information architecture is what's called a task analysis or a customer journey. This is where it's kind of like your storyboarding, but much more detailed. So in storyboarding, remember, you kind of thought about your persona performing an activity. Maybe your persona is checking his schedule while he's between classes, or your persona is, shopping for an item using your app in your storyboard. But a task analysis is a much more complete picture of everything that happens when a user engages with your experience. So as an example, we're going to talk about the customer journey through Starbucks. So a lot of times, if you're thinking about a product, you might think Starbucks, the product is coffee. Let me obsess about the coffee. But there's actually a lot of other things that go on when you interact with Starbucks. So let's just go through the customer journey of Starbucks. You start by entering the restaurant and standing in line. You approach the counter, you make an order. If you're ordering merchandise, you pay for it, and then you get the item, and then you ask for a bag or no bag, and then you leave, so it's done. But if you order coffee, then they take your name because it takes some time to prep the coffee. You exchange money. What does it say? Yeah, you get change if you paid in cash, or you get a receipt if regardless of how you paid. And then the order is made, and the order gets sent to the barista who makes the order. And then when you get the order, you take your drink to the drink station, and then you decide, let's see. Right, you decide how you want to add sugar, you want to add milk, whatever, or you throw away pieces that you don't need, and then you look for a place to sit. And then while you're sitting, you can do all these different activities, and at some point, maybe you use the bathroom, and then when you're done with your drink and when you're done with your activities, you then leave Starbucks. So when you think about a task analysis, this is also considered a very simple one. When you think about task analysis or customer journey, what you want to really deeply understand is all the things that happen between when a customer first starts interacting with your product and when he is done. And this is much, much, much more detailed than a storyboard. So I want as an exercise, this is very important to know how to do task analyses correctly. So as an exercise, we're going to practice making a detailed task analysis. So I don't want you to do your own product. I want you to do something a little bit simpler. So we're going to do one of four tasks. Taking an international flight, getting a new dishwasher, baking a chocolate cake and hiring a new employee. So I'm going to split up groups. So this table here, work on taking an international flight. This group here, you're going to work on getting a new dishwasher. That table there, you're working on baking a chocolate cake. And then everyone else is working on hiring a new employee. So for every single one of these tasks, I want you to draw a diagram that looks kind of like Starbucks, where you think about, like, from beginning to end, all the various steps and the possible branching that might happen when you are performing this task. Right? Does everybody understand which task they're doing? International flight, get a new dishwasher, bake a chocolate cake. Everyone else is doing hire a new employee. And I'll leave this up. This is also in your workbooks. So if you get confused, just take a look at it and think about whether your task analysis is at the right level of detail. So I walked around and I saw a lot of your task analyses. I think you guys are definitely going in the right direction. The one thing I will say about task analysis, we only have 15 minutes to do this exercise, but what I told some of the teams I talked to is that great design doesn't happen by accident. When you have great design, it's usually because someone spent a lot of time with attention to detail thinking about what your experience will be, thinking about how you perform a task, how you perform some goals. Because you don't generally, you can accidentally create bad UX, that happens all the time, right? But you generally don't accidentally create good UX. And part of creating good UX is having a very deep understanding of exactly what happens when somebody does something, which is why I encourage you, when you do task analyses for your own product, to think as detailed as possible about the various branching factors, and when you have a step that says look up possible companies, that's still really vague. Like, what actually happens? Like, I am going to Google, I type in the word dishwasher, I look at the first 5 results, I pick the one that seems the most relevant to me, I click on it, and then go to their website, I type on their search bar the dishwasher with the feature that I want, and then I look at their search. So the point is that the more detailed you are, the better you're going to be able to design your product. So when you actually do this exercise at home, doing it for your own product, I encourage you to be as detailed as possible. So we're going to move on because we don't have enough time to keep fleshing out your task analyses. So the next information architecture deliverable I want to talk about is sitemaps and hierarchical structure. So you guys have seen this kind of thing before. It's pretty common to see sitemaps, which is basically just showing the hierarchy of your site and how the sites relate to each other. So for example, I have an example sitemap that's in your workbooks. It's pretty simple. What I would recommend you do is, if you have a product you've already launched, is to map out your own sitemap so you understand what pages are sitting at what level in the hierarchy and how the different pages relate to each other. Because this informs your navigation model for your site. So the next thing I want to talk about is user flows. User flows are probably the most important thing to master in doing user experience design. What a user flow is unlike a task analysis. A task analysis is a picture of the customer in an ecosystem. The whole, if I'm going to take an international flight, first I'm going to talk to my friends about when they want to travel. Then I want to figure out when our calendars sync up and have a discussion about where you want to go. And then maybe we do some internet research to help us decide, and then yada, yada, yada. That's kind of the whole ecosystem of how somebody takes an international flight. A user flow is kind of the same thing as a task analysis, except specific to your product. So what you do is the same level of detail you use to map out what happens in the ecosystem, you're going to use to map out what happens in your product. So for example, a lot of key user flows are like, what is the sign up and login process? What is your onboarding? What are your tutorials? How do you create content? How do you submit content? How do you check out? How do you do social invitations, social sharing? How do you recover from errors? How do you handle notifications? What is the notification flow? And then search and discovery, how do people find things? So the kind of things that you need to show in your user flow, that level of detail, include things like error conditions, corner cases and exceptions, the user lifecycle. For example, a new user may see something different than an existing user who may see something different than an expert user. So what's the user lifecycle? And then what are the technical limitations? So I have a really simple example in your worksheet. There's the Facebook login, right? So the kind of detail that I want to see is visitor comes to your site. Then you do a system check. Is the user logged in on Facebook already? If they are, then just log them in directly. If they're not, then display the Facebook login button. And then when the user clicks in to sign in, you have like a completely different flow. Like you're going to provide your authentication information. You're going to check whether or not the account already exists. So all these level of detail, and all this level of detail goes into something as simple as you click on the Facebook button and it logs you in. Right? So I think I have another example also in your workbook that's a little more complex, that shows you what the branching decisions should look like. And so when you design a user flow, if you're doing it well, it's going to look really complicated because it is considering all the possible error states, all the possible differences in user level, technical limitations, technical checks. You're doing system check, user action, user flow. So usually, you're going to get really, really complicated with them. And in my experience, sometimes it's hard to think about the flow by itself. And what I sometimes do is I will kind of sketch the interface a little bit and then use the interface as part of my flow. So you can do this either manually by sketching, or you can do this digitally. But generally speaking, my advice for most designers is to stop designing screens and start designing flows. Because what happens if you start to wireframe, you start to design your user interface, and you don't understand your flow? What happens? You don't understand what information should go on what page. You don't make room for exceptions. What about possible errors? What about possible exception conditions or alternative paths? You're not going to design for those if you just jump right to the interface. So generally speaking, when I evaluate a designer's portfolio, I look primarily at their user flows. If I see that there are no user flows, that tells me this is not a very good UX designer. They don't understand, at the level of detail they need to understand, how a system works and how a user is interacting with a particular system, what's going to go wrong, what happens with different levels of users. So you have two examples in your workbook. One is the simple Facebook one. The other one is like an ad buying flow. And you can see the level of detail that they have. And when you're designing a typical user flow, what happens is a user action is an arrow, like a user choice is an arrow. A page is usually a square, and then a system decision, a system check is usually a diamond. So these standards change, and you can honestly make your own standards. The main thing is that you understand at what point does the system need to check for logic, at what point does the user make a branching decision. These are the level of details that need to go into your flows. So because this is what I consider to be one of the most important parts of UX design, it is how I evaluate a designer's portfolio. Obviously, now it's time to map out your own user flow because it's a very important exercise. So what you can do is, if you have a product, you should do the user flow for your most important user action. I want you to map out the flow for your most important user action. If you just have an idea, you can do it too. It might be a little bit more difficult. What you could do instead is take an app that you like, or an app you dislike, whatever. Take an app you like and then map out their core user flow. So if you don't have like a solid idea, take Facebook and map out, what is the flow for uploading a photo album on Facebook to an extreme level of detail. So if you have a product, do your own core user flow. If you have an idea, you could, but it might be difficult to get to the level of detail. And if you just kind of have an idea, take an app that you really like, pick their core user flow, and then I want to see user flow diagrams that are to this level of detail, ideally, where you consider user branching, system checks, user level, error conditions, intermediate states. So I saw you guys made some pretty detailed core user flows. So I think for the most part, everybody more or less understands the user flows. So good job, guys. I was pretty impressed. So let's keep moving. The last thing I want to talk about with information architecture is schematics. So schematics, also known as wireframes. So most of you already know how to make wireframes. You're very familiar with wireframes because that's the first thing people think of when they think of design for technology products. So with wireframes, there's a lot of things you can do. You can start by sketching because it's very lightweight, very easy, and it kind of stimulates your creative juices when you start sketching. You can also use templates. So when you're designing for mobile or you're designing for web, there are usually a lot of templates that you can use to sketch on to make your sketching a lot easier. You can also use like wireframing tools like Balsamic, Azure, Proto.io, InVision. There's a lot of tools that kind of let you drag and drop interface elements and very quickly build schematics and build wireframes. The thing that I really encourage you to do, something I find personally very useful is, earlier we talked about when you do your user flow, sometimes it helps to think about what that interface will look like, because then you know, okay, well, I know that from this page I have to have 5 branching factors because there's 5 possible ways to exit this page. So I really encourage that when you are designing your interface and you're designing your flow, that you then put the interface into your flow. So in this particular case, it shows like every single button, where it goes, what the possible interactions are on every single page. And then you can do this more easily. At this point, if you're going to be doing flows with interface, it's a lot easier just to use a piece of software because that way it's easy to track different error states and different versions, different user levels, because this kind of diagram starts to get really big really fast. And the last thing I want to talk about doing schematics is when you're doing schematics for information architecture purposes, don't worry about the design from like a color or layout standpoint. I try to make sure that my first set of schematics is always grayscale. I don't worry about color. I don't worry about how pretty the buttons look. I don't worry about like the typography. All I figure out is on every given page, what are the possible entrances? What are the possible exits? What are the possible error states? What are the different levels of information depending on the different kind of user or the state of the user? So don't worry about making stuff look pretty at this stage. It's mostly about like how complete is your flow? Like have you captured all the entrances, all the exits, what the possible error states are, different user levels. I had this exercise where we take your user flow and we sketch it, but I think we're slightly running out of time. So we're going to skip this stage, but generally speaking, once you do your core flow, you've mapped out your core flows, the next stage is then to take your interfaces very roughly and then put them into your flows, kind of like in these examples. But we are going to skip this particular exercise because we are slightly running out of time. So information architecture methods. A lot of times when people think of UX design, they think just of this one piece, which is schematics and wireframes. But this is really only one of many different information architecture methods, right? So we talked about concept maps, which is where you take different insights and you group them together based on what the patterns are that you see. Mind maps, same thing, linking together different concepts so you understand, what are the different big pieces, what are the sub pieces. Gap analysis. That's when you draw a line, you put all the user needs and user questions on top, you put all the existing solutions on the bottom, you start to see the gap between what users say they want and what actually exists. Taxonomy and metadata, classification for content, Very important if you're an e-commerce site, if you're a media site, if you have any volume of information that users need to be able to navigate through. Very important. Content inventory, that's when you analyze the existing content on a site to help you understand how to redesign it. And then we worked on a couple exercises. We did task analysis, where task analysis is about understanding the user's journey through an entire ecosystem. So when you talk about taking an international flight, it's how do you research your flight, how do you schedule your flight, how do you buy the flight you want, how do you download your boarding pass, how do you get to the airport, how do you check in, all that stuff. Whereas a user flow is what happens inside your app. Maybe you have an app that helps travelers find airport lounges. Then that flow happens when they open your app. Do they sign in? Do they not sign in? Do you automatically pull their location or not? What happens when you can detect a location versus when you can't detect a location? The user flow is what happens inside your product. The task analysis is what happens in the ecosystem outside of your product. In both cases, you want them to be very detailed, because the better you understand your user's environment, the better you understand the flows in your product, the better your overall UX is going to be. And then finally, sitemaps, which is just your hierarchy. There's an example in your workbook. And then schematics and wireframes. We don't spend that much time because most people over-focus on wireframes. And really, you want to make sure that you've done a lot of the other UX design methods, like task analysis and user flows, before you over-focus on your wireframes. So anyway, like I said, when you're doing design for information architecture, you try not to focus too much on making it look pretty or making the colors look right. You're not at that point yet. So for example, for any given page, there's a gazillion different possible ways to design it. So this is like a sketch of what the Facebook privacy bar might look like. And you can do it a gazillion ways in terms of how you actually implement the exact look and feel. And so that takes us into our next section, which is interaction design. Remember, we talked earlier, interaction design is the design of affordances. An affordance is an aspect of an object that communicates to you how that object is to be used. So more formally, the qualities or properties of an object or control that define its possible uses or make clear how it can be used. Remember earlier we talked about that example of a door? How do you know if you should push it versus pull it? Well, one has a flat panel. You can't do anything except push it. The other one has a handle, so you know you might be able to pull it. So what is this? It's a chair. How do you know that it's a chair? There's a cushion, okay. What else? There's like this nice scoop for your butt, right? I mean, there's a lot of chairs that look really weird, but immediately you look at it and you know that it's a chair, right? How do you know, how to use these utensils? When you look at a spoon, it has this concavity that lets you scoop things. So you know the spoon is supposed to be used for scooping things. A knife, it's very narrow and it's sharp, so you know it's used for cutting and slicing things. A fork has prongs, you can stab things with it. So all of these have affordances that teach you how to use this particular tool. So on the web, you're thinking about all these different kinds of affordances, right? Buttons, sliders, text bars, all kinds of things. And there's really like a million different ways to design a button. There's a million different ways to design text fields, a million different ways to design sliders. So all of these design decisions, they're very tactical. So I'm not going to over-focus. I'm not going to tell you, here are the 5 million different ways you can design buttons. Instead, what we're going to talk about is what are the principles behind good interaction design. Not focusing on here are the gazillion ways you can design buttons. So the question is, how do you design an effective affordance, right? What is this? It's a button, right? How do you know that it's a button? How do you know what can you do with this? You can push it, right? How do you know? You know because it has a bit of a 3D look. It kind of looks like it's elevated above a level, and it has this it's red colored, so you think it's supposed to attract your attention, right? So you know that this button should be pushed. But the problem is a lot of times people design affordances that are not very clear. For example, look at this. You have this door handle, And on one side, you have to put a sign that says push, and the other side, you have to put a sign that says pull. Now, if you have an affordance and you have to label it, you've already failed. Think about how stupid it would be if you had to label all your tools and describe how they're supposed to be used. Like, oh, this is a scoop, you have to scoop with this. Like, oh, you slice with this one and you stab with that one. That's a fail, right? So instead of designing poorly in such an ambiguous way that you have to add labels, what you could do instead is think more cleverly. Like, for example, if I want someone to push, I make it impossible for them to do anything except to push. So this is one possible design. And here's another possible design, right? So in this case, it's a little weirder. But on one hand, you just cannot pull that other doorknob. You have to push it. So how do you see this principle happen in mobile apps and in websites? Here's a screenshot from an app called Moleskine. Moleskine is a sketchbook app, and it lets you kind of do doodles. As you can see, they've labeled every single one of their icons. If you have to label your icons for people to understand what they are, you have already failed. Here's an example of a different sketchbook app, same functionality, very different UI. What's the difference in this app? They don't label any of their icons. Why? Because you can tell that this is a ballpoint pen. You can tell because it looks like a ballpoint pen. Their marker tool looks like a marker. Their brush tool looks like a brush tool, as opposed to, I can't tell what those icons mean. Right? It's not obvious what those icons mean, so much that I have to label it. Not a good design of an affordance. So in this particular case, not only do the tools look like what they do, they also show you what they look like. So they kind of draw, something that looks calligraphic. When you use this pen, you're going to get thin and thick strokes, just like you do with a real calligraphy pen. Your pencil looks like a pencil. Your brush looks kind of like watercolor. You get a sense of what it looks like because they show instead of telling you what a tool does. So in this particular case, it's a fail because they have to tell you what the tool does. In this case, they kind of show you what the tool does. It's a much more intuitive interface. You don't have to have a whole tutorial to teach you, how to use this sketchbook app. Now, there are exceptions. For example, this is Photoshop, right? It's a very, very, very complex expert system. In fact, it could remind you a little bit about this, right? This cockpit picture we saw before, very complex. Like, how do you feel looking at this interface? Do you want to use Photoshop? It takes designers years to master Photoshop, and most designers still don't know all the functionality of Photoshop. So this might be the only exception when you might have to add labels, is you literally have so much functionality, you've designed it for an expert system that you have to add labels to your tools. But if you're not designing for an expert, you should be careful about whether or not you're adding labels. If you see that you're adding a lot of labels to your affordances, chances are you haven't made them as intuitive as you could be, maybe because you haven't really showed them how they could be used. So I want to go back to this, the door handle example. So a lot of times the reason you see the same door handle on both sides, even though they're completely different functions, is because it's beautiful, right? Look at this, it's a beautiful door. It's a glass door, it's very symmetric, it's very beautiful. But the problem is that just because something is beautiful and simple does not mean that it is clear and that it is usable. So let me show you an example. 3 different submit buttons. Which one is the most easy to use? The one on the right. Why? Because it looks like a button, right? But now when you see design trends, a lot of people are going towards minimal design or flat design, and you have buttons that look on the left. How can you tell that's a button? It kind of looks like it just has text. If it didn't say the word submit, or if you didn't understand English, you might not realize that's a submit button. So let's look at a couple other examples. This is the original iOS calculator, and that's the iOS calculator now. Which one is easier to use? Why? Because the buttons are really obvious, the colors pop a little bit more. With that one, it's kind of flat and it's just slightly harder to use, even though people might say the one on the right looks cleaner, that it looks more elegant. This is the Windows phone. A lot of people complain about the UX of Windows phones. Why? What makes this interface difficult to use? Too much, so there's a lot going on. What else? Can you tell which is a button and which is content? Can you differentiate? For example, I can't tell if I can click on that photo or not, and it looks like some of these might be content, like like my calendar. I don't know if I can click on it, and then even if I could click on everything, there's a huge difference between clicking and getting a photo versus clicking and launching an app. But there's just no material differentiation between what is actually happening when I click on any of these boxes. So the affordances are not very clear. So let's go through a couple other examples. Do you know where you're going to enter your email? The way this works is you tap that line, enter your email, and it turns into a free-form text. You type it in, and then as soon as you finish, it has it loads a go button, and it lets you log in. That's just very confusing, right? So what are some ways you can make this more obvious? Well, you could put a box around it, and then it's like, okay, I can see that you put your email around it. And even better, you can make the background white. You can differentiate it from the background so that people can identify this is a text field. Facebook did something very similar. Facebook was testing the search when they launched graph search. They were testing the search field. And which one of these do you think performed the best? The last one. Why? Because it's obvious that you can type something there, right? It's not at all obvious, especially with the first one. I don't know who would type anything there, but the other ones, it's just not as obvious that you can type something there, right? Which one of these is easier to find the search button? The one on the right, right? But which one is cleaner and more elegant? A lot of people would say the one on the left is cleaner and more elegant because it has the same symmetry as the rest of the app. But it's a little bit more ambiguous. You don't know if that's a title bar, a tab bar, or if that's a button. Whereas the one on the right, it's very obvious it's a button, even though it's not as crisp and clean as the one on the left. So that's what I would, please be mindful that just because something looks pretty doesn't mean that it's very clear. A lot of times people compensate by making things look pretty without actually realizing that it actually makes it harder on the user. So just keep that in mind as principle number 2. Something that's beautiful doesn't necessarily mean that it's usable. Principle number 3, experiences are more important than tasks. So let's look at the hierarchy of product design, so to speak. At the very bottom level is your product functional? Does it do everything you promise it will do? Second, is it reliable? Is it accurate? Third, is it usable? Can your product be used with no difficulty? Remember earlier we talked about the definition of a good user experience, and Don Norman said the first requirement is that you meet your user needs without fuss or bother. Right? Using your app should be like going on a tropical vacation. I shouldn't have to think very hard to figure out how to use your app. The next level is it convenient? Is it very intuitive, and is it very easy for me to use? Does it fit seamlessly into my life? And then you can do even better. Is it pleasurable? Am I having a good experience such that I want to share this experience with my friends? And then finally, the very top is meaningful. Is this a meaningful experience? Am I having a deep emotional experience with this product? Like the way that I have if I go on a great vacation, or the way that I feel if I drive into a party with my Ferrari. Like, is it a meaningful experience on top of being just pleasurable? So when you go to design something and you focus on just the tasks, you say, oh, we need function A, B, and C. We need feature A, B, and C. What you do is you're focused on products and features. You're objective and you're focused on quantifiable stuff, but you're probably just focusing on the bottom level of that pyramid, which is, are you functional? Are you meeting base level requirements? Whereas if you focus on experiences, you're focused on people, emotions, context. It's a much more subjective and qualitative process. So when you're thinking about this pyramid, the cutoff line is usually about this level, at convenience. under convenience, and it's very hard to say you have a great UX. If you're in a very competitive market, you might not be able to stand out because your UX is not that impressive. At the level of convenience and above, that's usually when people start to brag about your app, start to say this app is very well designed. So just be mindful when you're designing your product, are you over-focused on features, or are you going to focus on experiences and giving people significant meaning when using your app? So now your question is probably like, well, okay, that's great, I understand that, but how do I make an experience pleasurable and meaningful? So I want to talk about, when we first started this workshop, I talked about experiences that were good and bad, and I tried to avoid technology experiences, because if you want to think about good user experience, it's not just related to technology products. You can have a lot of great user experiences doing all kinds of other things. For example, having, a dinner party with your friends. This is a pleasurable experience for most people because we're social animals and we crave human interaction. We crave social interaction, especially when we're trying to achieve our goals. So principle number 4, if you want to make a product more than just convenient, you want to make it meaningful or pleasurable, then you want to make your interactions human. In other words, you don't want to be socially awkward. What do I mean by this? Let's first talk about, what kind of people do you dislike? What kind of people do you not like to be friends with? Or do you just like everybody? You just love everybody. What are some characteristics of people you don't like? Sorry, what? Loud people. People who are rude, right? They're interrupting. What else don't you like? Sorry, what? Negative thinking. You don't like people who are negative thinkers. What else don't you like? People who are stuck up. Yeah, so you don't like loud people, negative people, people who are stuck up, right? So for example, you mentioned negative thinkers. I mean, if you're like at a party and you're like, hey, I'm working on a new startup, I have this idea for XYZ, and you meet some guy and he's like, you're gonna fail. How do you feel about that? You're gonna be like, ugh, I don't want to be your friend. I don't want to hang out with you. So we don't like negative people. We don't like stuck-up people. We don't like people who, make us feel bad. So what happens when you see an error kind of like this? You're like, in Office, Microsoft Office, you're writing your business plan, and all of a sudden, a fatal exception has occurred. Okay, not a fatal exception has occurred. Let's analyze this more. A fatal exception has occurred at F0AD42494C4C. What's wrong? Okay, first of all, not only has an exception occurred, but a fatal exception has occurred. If you're not familiar with the word fatal, it means causing death and or leading to failure or disaster. So you just told somebody, oh my God, you were trying to finish your business plan, but guess what? You failed. Like you had this disastrous outcome. So you want to be careful a lot with your language, right? There's really no reason you should use the word fatal or any derivative thereof unless you're designing like Mortal Kombat or some other kind of like violent video game, right? If you think about it, a video game is the only time when a user actually expects to die unexpectedly, lose their work, and have to start again. It's really bad when you're kind of like in your Excel spreadsheet building a business model, and all of a sudden it's like fatality, like round 2 fight, like you don't get anything. So it's just a terrible experience. And so you have to be really careful your language when you speak to your user, especially when things go wrong. So what else is wrong with this statement? Do you know how to fix this exception? Why? Do you know what F0AD42494C4C means? Nobody understands what that means. What does that kind of remind you of? Like, for me, I feel like, we all know people who are really nice, but like super, super nerdy, right? Like super nerdy, and you kind of ask them simple questions. You're like, hey, my light is broken, how do I fix it? And then they give you this like mumbo jumbo. They're like, let me tell you about physics and Faraday's law and Maxwell's equation, and you're like, how does that actually help me fix my light? So this happens a lot, right? In software products, something happens or someone has a question, someone has an error, and your software, tells them like technical mumbo jumbo, something that doesn't actually help them solve their problem. That is socially awkward, just like being super negative is socially awkward. So let's think instead, what kind of people do you like hanging out with? Like, do you want to be friends with this chick? You want to be friends with her, right? Why? She looks happy. She's positive. She has friends. Social validation. Other people like her too. So you want to be friends with her, right? And you like people who make you laugh or make you feel positive, right? So does this page make you feel positive? You like try to find a site and it's like, this page cannot be found. Like, the page you are looking for might have been, really? It's not very positive, right? But what about this one? How do you feel about this 404 page? It's really positive, right? They've got not one rainbow. They have 3 rainbows. 3 rainbows, okay? Triple rainbow. And they have this guy dressed up as a unicorn. And it's like, look, we can't find your page, but here's a unicorn and some rainbows. Now, I'm not telling you that you should put rainbows on your error messages. This just happens to be a brand that's very funky and fun, so they put rainbows all over it. But you can still be, within your brand, within your character, and communicate with your user. For example, this is the 404 page for the New Museum. The New Museum in New York is a very, edgy, modern museum. So they're not going to put rainbows and unicorns on their error page. But you can see, like, they put oops between the names. So it's the New Oops Museum. And they say, oh, something went wrong, the page you're trying to access doesn't appear to exist. Are you looking for anything specific? Maybe our search tool can help, right? So when you imagine, like, if you're lost and you ask somebody, hey, where do I need to go? And they're like, I don't know. How do you feel about that? That's terrible, right? But if they're like, oh, hey, like, I see that you're lost. Where do you want to go? Like, let me try to help you. That's a good social experience, right? So one of my favorite 404 pages is actually NPR. So NPR, if you're not familiar, is a news site in the US that is very intellectual. So they're like very, they like to cover a lot of art and culture. And so this is the 404 page. They say, oh, it's a shame that your page is lost, but guess what? Look at all these other things that are lost. You can read articles about, Amelia Earhart, or, the Watergate tapes that are missing. Or maybe your luggage. And so you see that you don't have to put rainbows and unicorns, but you can be human, and your personality can reflect a personality of your product or site without being a negative douchebag and without being like some super technical uber nerd that doesn't actually communicate. So let's look at a couple more examples. This is a sign-up form for, I think, Yelp. And when there's an error, it's like a required field was not filled. It's kind of like you went into some bureaucratic office to fill out some paperwork, and you did something wrong, and the lady's like, you didn't fill out the paperwork. You need to do it again. Like that's how it feels. Or you're like, a required field was not filled. What about this? It's like you fill it out, or you're trying to fill it out, you make an error, and it's just like a one-word answer. That's kind of like, when you ask for directions, the guy's like, yeah, it's over there. Okay, well, that's useful, kind of. Versus this example. You didn't fill out the required fields. Oops, something went wrong. I need you to fill in your name. Your email address looks a little weird. I need you to, put something that actually looks like an email address. Your password, sorry, it's too short. I need at least 4 characters, and it also didn't match your confirmation, so please try again. And sorry, but you must accept the terms of services. So you can see the difference. Like, this is like just kind of, just straightforward. It does tell you what the problem is, but it doesn't feel that great. When you get this error, you don't feel that great about it. But when you get an error like this, you think, oh, okay, I understand exactly what's going wrong. I know exactly how to fix it. I feel like this is just a more human interaction. Right, so we're going to do an exercise where we get to identify social awkwardness. So I need you to think about your worst user experiences with technology products. Like think about bugs and apps that you absolutely hate. And then I want you to find a partner that you haven't met yet. So someone that you haven't met, you've all been sitting too long on the same tables. So walk around, get up, walk around, find somebody that you haven't met. Do that now. Ah, don't be lazy. We're practicing how not to be socially awkward, so find somebody else and introduce yourself like a human being. Pick a new person.
Unfortunately, the catering guys leave it after 4. So can we go to tea break now for 15 minutes? And then continue it while during the tea break. 15 minutes more.
You know what? Let me describe the exercise and they'll do it during the tea break.
Sure.
All right, so let me describe the exercise and I want you two to do it during the tea break because we're going to have a tea break now. So basically, pick a new partner. Go, get up. Don't be socially awkward. Go introduce yourself to somebody, say hi, make a new friend. Okay. All right. Okay. When you find your partner, great. Find your partner, go. Find your partner, don't be awkward. When you find your partner, someone you haven't worked with already, what I want you to do is, I want you to pick software experiences that you guys hate. Think about really bad UX that you absolutely despise. And I want you to role play. One person is the software, one person is the user. I want you to talk to each other like the software talks to you. And then I want you to identify exactly what is wrong with that interaction. So you're going to practice identifying socially awkward interactions in apps. So we covered several principles of interaction design. We talked about the fact that you want to show, not tell, because an affordance should be obvious in terms of how it's being used. We talked about how just because something is beautiful doesn't mean that it's usable. We talked about a lot of examples of beautiful looking design that was actually not very clear. We also talked about making your interactions human. Because software that's really socially awkward, like Microsoft error messages, just make people feel bad for no good reason. So let's continue and let's talk about more principles. I want to talk about this fifth principle. Maybe I'll wait for the dishes to stop making noises. All right, so I want to talk about this fifth principle, which is giving feedback. So going back to social awkward stories, maybe you've had this experience too, but let's say you go on a date, and you go out with this guy or this girl that you really like, and you have some drinks. First date, you have some drinks, you have a really good conversation, you really get along with this person. And you go home and you're like, oh, I'm sure he's going to call me for a second date, and he never does. And you spend all this time waiting by the phone, waiting for this guy to call you for a second date, and he never does. Why is this awkward? This is awkward because one, you have no idea what happened. Did he get hit by a bus? Did he get sent to a foreign country where there is no internet and no phone? Did he lose your number? People come up with all kinds of reasons. What happened? Most of the time it's because he didn't like you, right? So you got rejected. But the problem is you got rejected and you don't know why. You have no idea what you did wrong. Did you wear the wrong clothes? Did you smell bad? Were you too tall, too short? You have no idea. So you have a problem. You don't understand the state of the problem, and you don't understand what was wrong, so you can't fix it. So what is an example of this kind of awkward interaction happening in your interaction design? Say, for example, you have a button, submit, and you go and you hit this button, and then nothing happens. Why is that a bad user experience? It's like the guy who doesn't call you back. You have no idea what happened. You don't know if it's like the system is failing, or maybe you didn't push the button correctly, or maybe your internet is down. You just have no idea what happened, right? So whenever you design interactions, you have to have a clear feedback loop, and you have to keep the user aware of what's going on, right? So anytime a user takes an action, there needs to be a visible effect that then tells the user what is happening. For example, we talked about minimizing windows earlier. I talked about how my mom freaks out every time I minimize a window. Because on Windows, when you minimize a window, it kind of just disappears. But on Mac OS X, you get feedback. You see the window. When you click minimize, kind of shrinks. So it gives you feedback. Yes, we received your action. Yes, we are responding. And yes, we have the correct response, right? So when you think about designing your affordances and designing your controls, you need to make sure that they communicate to the user what the status of the system is and give the user an understanding of the results of their actions, right? So here is an example of a button. How do you know that you pushed a button? How do you know that the system received your action? So you see on one hand, there's a button that's just normal. When you push it, it looks depressed. And then when it's active, it comes back out, but it has the light flashing, right? So you understand, okay, I pushed the button, the system has received my request, now it is processing my request, right? You may also want to think about like disabled states. So a lot of times, you have a sign-up form, and you have a disabled button in the bottom, but it's not indicated as disabled. So you fill out the form thinking you're complete. You push the button, nothing happens, right? What you could do is instead is, if a user hasn't completely filled out all the required form fields, have a button that looks disabled. It's obvious you cannot push that button yet, right? So communicating to the user, is it a normal state? Are you active or are you disabled? That's pretty important. The other thing you could do is, if your system is processing, you could show a loading icon, right? So this is very common, like, we've all waited around watching loading icons all the time. But just the loading icon itself is not necessarily good design, right? For example, you guys are all probably familiar with this, like, when you're messaging somebody and they're typing, there's like a ... right, that tells you that they're typing. So it was really funny. I read a New York Times article about how this texting loading indicator causes anxiety. So bubbles carry a lot of weight. Texting anxiety caused by little bubbles. So it says, it's called the typing awareness indicator, and a few months ago, my therapist ordered me to disable it on my phone. Quote, "It's causing you too much anxiety," she said, pointing to the iPhone I had in a white knuckle grip. "It's giving monumental weight to matters of a text message." So, for example, it's really awkward when you text your friend, you're at a concert or something, you're waiting in a really long line and got to the front of the bar. You're like, "Hey, I'm at the front of the line, what can I get you?" ... And it's almost better if they didn't respond at all, right? Because then you're like, "Sorry, you didn't get back to me in time, so I got myself a beer, but you don't get anything," But when it's like ... you're like, "God damn it, tell me what you want already," right? You're sitting there like waiting in this awkward situation. You're like, "Oh, what do you want?" Right? What's even worse, right? Just waiting for this typing is like, let's say you say, "I love you." ... Nothing. Oh my God! He doesn't love me. This is a fatality. Oh my God! This is absolutely terrible, right? Like, you saw that he was typing something. He stopped typing. Nothing. That's terrible, right? So, what can you do to improve your loading screens, right? One, you can give a user more information. Part of the reason why the texting anxiety is so anxiety-provoking is you don't know what they're saying. You don't know what they're saying, right? So you're sitting there, ... You're waiting. You don't know when it's going to end. So one thing you can do with loading screens is just make it a progress bar instead. So okay, You know you're only going to wait a certain amount of time before you're done. And you know, okay, my wait time is about 50% finished, right? And you can also be more explicit about what you're actually doing, right? You're saying, okay, I'm downloading now. This is my action. I'm 64% done. And when I'm done, boom, okay, I've completed your download, right? So this is another example where, okay, I'm sending your file. This is the file that we're sending. This is how big it is. You're 28% done, right? That said, this can still cause some kind of problems, right? Like copying files to backup, estimated time until complete, 4 years. Are you going to wait? You know, sometimes, you know, when I have something that I queue up and I see it takes too long, I just cancel the action, I give up. So you have to be kind of careful with loading bars. There's a lot of opportunity to kind of make this experience not as crappy, right? So for example, there's a modifier you can download from Mac called the Nyan Cat progress bar. It turns all your progress bars into Nyan Cat rainbows. And so even if you're waiting a long time, it's kind of fun because you see this little cat moving around, right? So things that you could do, especially if you know that a process takes a very long time, is, you know, just kind of have some personality. Be a human being, right? If you're waiting in line somewhere, you kind of want somebody to come and say, hey, I'm really sorry you're in line, but here's like a cupcake. You know, be a little bit more fun about the process of waiting, right? So, for example, this is kind of a fun loading bar, and as you're loading, it fills up your beer. So there's a lot of things you can do if you're in a situation where you have to make a user wait to make that a less crappy experience. Because apparently loading screens cause anxiety. So you have to be kind of careful, you know, thinking about your user experience, giving people feedback as to what the status of a system is, that you receive their action and that their actions and their requests are being processed. So principle number 6, simplify wayfinding. So just earlier, we talked about task analyses and user flows, and we discovered, you know, your software is probably more complex than you thought it was. You thought you were buying coffee, now you have this giant flow chart of a bunch of things that can happen while you're buying coffee. So software ends up a lot of times being a lot more complex than you think, even for you as a designer. So just imagine what your user thinks coming into, you know, your complex environment. Because you can have all kinds of extremely, you know, complex nested sitemaps, you know, and sometimes your user feels like they're stuck in a maze. Like they can't figure out how to do certain things. So, for example, something that really sucks is really long sign-up forms, right? Really, really long sign-up forms are one of like the worst UX mistakes and most common UX mistakes. So what can you do to make this process less crappy? Well, you can use something like pagination to break up your form and then tell people where they are in your sign-up form. For example, when you sign up for Facebook, this is what you see. You know, step 1, you add friends. Step 2, find friends. Step 3, you're going to fill out your profile information. Step 4, you're going to join a network. So you kind of understand, okay, I'm signing up for Facebook. It's a complicated procedure, but I only see 1 step at a time, and I know I'm 2 steps in a 4-step process. That's a lot more fun than, you know, you're filling out this form. You're like, how many forms? Like, why do they need to know this information? So much information. So one way to provide more wayfinding to help a user understand where he is in your system is by offering pagination. But you have to be careful because just like the loading bar, you can discourage users too, right? So if you see, you know, a form and has 1,055 pages, you're not going to fill out that form. So you'd have to be kind of careful when you use pagination that you don't also cause a bad user experience through your design. So the most obvious way you do wayfinding is through navigation design, right? So when you have tabs on a bar, the tabs correspond to different pages, and users are able to find where they are or find what they need and also know where they are, right? At all times, a user should understand, if I'm on this page, where is this page relative to all the other pages on my site? So for example, this is Salesforce's website. Do you have any idea? So at the top, it's products, community, industries, services, customers, events, and about us. Do you have any idea which page you're on? No. Why? It's not clear where I am on this. So let's say I'm browsing, and I say, oh, I want to go back to this other information. Okay, crap. How do I do that? So when you design your tab bar, you need to make sure you make it very clear to a user where they are on your site by, for example, highlighting the active page. So you can do it this way. You can also do it the way Behance does it, which is, hey, when I'm on this page, I make sure that I highlight it and the color is very different. You can also do like a double nested, right? So here it's like I know that I'm under topics, and under topics I'm on credit, right? So when you're designing navigation, there's an important concept called information scent. Information scent is how many clues you give somebody that tells them what's behind a door, right? So here you have 5 white doors, no labels. How do you know, which way to go? So for example, let's say you're in a foreign country, you want to go to the bathroom, you see these 2 signs. Which one's men and which one's women? If you don't speak German, maybe you're not going to know, right? So how do people solve this problem? They usually have, men and women, and then they show this icon too. That gives you information scent to tell you behind this door is the women's bathroom. So if you're a man, don't go in there. But if you just have, the word, you might not be enough information for the user to know what's behind that door. So for example, bathrooms usually have an icon and a text. But a lot of times, you just use an icon, especially on mobile, because you don't have that much space. And sometimes this can work, right? For example, which one's the women's bathroom? Which one's the women's bathroom? Which one? You think the women's bathroom is the one on the right? Left, okay, I was going to say, yeah. It's the one on the left, but it's not obvious. You have to think about that for a second, right? Why? You want me to explain why? I'm going to let you think about that. I'm going to let somebody explain it to you in private why that one is the women's bathroom. But it's like not everybody gets it, and you have to think about it for a little bit. Like for example, here's an interface. From where you're sitting, can you tell, what is the difference between this icon, and that icon? They all look like they're related to music, right? Does that give you enough information about what's behind the door? So when you use just icons, you have to be kind of careful, because if it's not a standard icon, people might not understand what it means. Android has different standards of icons than iOS does. So when you design for mobile, or when you design in a space where you're using primarily icons as navigation, you have to be kind of careful that not everyone's going to understand what it means. On the flip side, a lot of times you see people who use too many icons, and too many icons for the same thing. So if you have a couple different ways to get to the same place, it can be very confusing where you are in a system, right? So one of the biggest examples is a project called Microsoft Bob. So Microsoft Bob was probably the most famous failed UI in all of computer history. And what they did was they thought they were going to be clever. They were like, okay, we already have folders with desktops, right? So we're just going to take that model and just run with it. We're just going to make the whole thing your office, right? What is the problem with this? The problem is that, one, it's completely reliant on icons, right? And we already saw that icons by themselves. Like, for example, okay, that's a calendar in the middle, okay? But then what is the 0? Is that a calculate? I don't know. And then, what is the 3? I don't know. So first, it's using a lot of icons, right? And then it seems like there might be more than one way to go in. So for example, like that icon on the top also looks like it's a planner. Is that also part of your calendar? So it's really confusing, one, because it's using way too many icons. The icons do not have enough information sent. You can't tell based on this icon what's going on. And it's just way too many freaking icons, too many icons. So everybody hated this. This is just, nobody liked to use this user interface, even though it was, they thought they were being really clever. Like they thought they were being really edgy with their design. So another common problem is a lot of times, especially when you're an expert in your space, sometimes when you design the language on your site, you presume some kind of expertise on behalf of your user, right? So here's bathroom sign, where if you didn't pay attention during high school biology, you might not know which one is male versus female, right? And it sounds really silly, but it happens all the time. For example, this is ESPN's website. Do you guys know what NCAAF is? Or NCAAM? Does anybody know? Do you guys know what NFL is? You guys know what NFL is? Okay. So why can't they just be like football, I think people know what football means, right? But instead they're using, I don't know who knows what NC, I didn't Google it. But this is just an example of doing something like this, where you assume that your user has some level of knowledge, which may or may not be the case, right? So with ESPN, maybe if I'm only targeting, sports fanatics, maybe they know what NCAAF or NCAAM is, although I suspect that most people don't that go on the ESPN website. What could they do better? They could just say, my ESPN, football, baseball, soccer, hockey. That would be a lot easier, right? So something you could do to help with your navigation is sometimes you have a little bit more ambiguity, right? So you can do things like add metadata. So in this particular example, it's home, graphics, inspiration, coding, design. Now, if I'm looking for something, I won't necessarily know if it's between graphics and design. If I'm looking for something, I don't know if that's distinguished enough, right? So in this particular example, there's metadata underneath that tag that says, oh, graphics. Underneath graphics is wallpapers and icons. Underneath inspiration is photos and showcases. Underneath the design is, Photoshop files, fonts, and freebies. So now you're thinking, oh, okay, I'm looking for whatever it is I'm looking for. Now I know where to go. Otherwise, if that wasn't there, let's say I'm looking for a font. I don't know, I might go to graphics because a font is a graphic element, right? I might not necessarily go to design. So here's another example of just adding a little bit of metadata, right? So this shows the category and then the number of articles underneath that category. So if I'm looking for something, maybe I'll click on something with a higher number because I think there's a greater likelihood of finding it. So this just is an example of just very subtle adding some metadata, some additional information sent about what is behind a door. And basically, helping people with navigation becomes extremely important when you have more complexity in your navigation, right? So if you guys remember Windows, Windows was all about, going into these nested menus and, searching for things and usually never finding them. And so, for example, what's challenging about this? If you look at, I was find solitaire, okay, solitaire. The way you find solitaire is you go to programs, accessories, games, and solitaire. That's kind of weird because you don't think of games as accessories, right? So there's a really good chance that people will not find it, and that's why people hated Windows. It's half the time I can't find the thing that I need. So how do you fix this problem? Remember we talked in user research, you did card sorting. What is the point of card sorting? Card sorting is understanding how your users like to categorize things, not how you, the engineer, or you, the domain expert, like to categorize things. Understanding how your users organize information, super, super important. Another thing is when you have really deep levels of navigation, you want to let the user know where they are. So you can use something called breadcrumbs. So they call it breadcrumbs. It's kind of like when you leave a trail, you just leave breadcrumbs. And then somebody can follow the breadcrumbs to find you, and then you can follow the breadcrumbs back to figure out where you started from. So in this case, you have, you're 4 levels deep in a navigation system, but you know exactly where you are. You're at home, server-side coding, server-side essentials, and then introducing Joomla, right? So that gives you some information about where you are. So where you tend to see this is in really content-heavy sites like Amazon, right? If you're in Amazon, you want to find a product. Is it home and kitchen, KitchenAid blenders, right? Where is it? So let's try an exercise, right? Reddit is a really popular site, especially for posting news articles. If you wanted to find news about startups, where would you go? The top bar reads hot, new, rising, controversial, top, glided, wiki, and prompted. Promoted. Do you guys know where to start? Do you guys know how to look up startup articles? The point is that it's not very obvious, right? So, and also I'm really confused because what is the difference between hot and top? I mean, it kind of seems like the same thing, right? And what is the difference between new and rising? Like, I guess I kind of guess maybe rising is it's got momentum, but it could be an old article. The point is that this navigation is not giving you a lot of information sent, right? You have absolutely no idea how to find topics or posts or submissions of a particular topic without physically searching for it, right? So let's look at a different example. This is Mashable. Now, how would you find articles about startups on this site? Business, okay. Any other ideas? Tech. So it's a little bit confusing. It could be under business or under tech. So if you're on Mashable, if you hover over tech, just hovering, not clicking on it, if you hover over tech, this is what you see. It shows you sample articles from technology, and then it shows you the sub-navigation topics. So all tech, apps and software, dev and design, gadgets, and mobile. So if you're looking for articles about mobile startups, maybe you stop right here. You say, oh, okay, I found it. I'm going to click on mobile, right? But maybe you're looking for more generic startup information. So let's try to hover over business. Okay, look. Business, a couple different articles. I see the first article. It seems kind of promising. Tweak your startup hiring strategy. And then on the side, you see the options. All business, advertising, jobs, marketing, media, small business, startups. Which one was easier to use, Reddit or Mashable? Why? Mashable does a really good job telling you, giving you information sent about what's behind a certain page. I found this out without clicking on any links. I just hovered over that top level navigation and it showed me, here's what's behind the door, right? That way I know if I click on it, this is where I really want to go. Let's look at another example. If you wanted to find leather gloves for men that are meant to be used outdoors, where would you go? I mean, first of all, it's just overwhelming, right? And then you don't really know, okay, well, do I go under home, garden, and tools? Or do I go under sports and outdoors? Or do I go under men's clothing? It's not super obvious, right? So the challenge with big e-commerce sites is that there's always just, you have so many kinds of users. They have a different mindset for how to categorize. But you can still try a little bit harder to give more information sent, right? For example, if I go to LL Bean and I hover over footwear, it breaks footwear into a couple different categories, like girls, boys, infants, men's, slippers, socks, women's. And then it says find it fast, like are you looking for all these other things? And then it sorts by like new arrivals, top rated by customers, and featured. So at the very least, instead of showing me a giant list, it kind of tries to break down the information in a way that might make it easier for me to find. So, principles of interaction design. We talked about showing, not telling. If you have to label your buttons, if you have to label an affordance, chances are you have already failed. Remember in the examples that we talked about, there was one example where there was an app that had to label all of the icons because when you use icons, it's not always obvious what's behind the door. And then the other example we saw had the icons look like the actual tools, so it was very obvious what they did. Second principle we talked about is that just because something is beautiful doesn't mean that it's usable. So in a lot of cases, when you see something that looks minimalist or clean, sometimes it's actually not giving the user enough information about how it is supposed to be used. The third thing we talked about is that experiences are more important than tasks, which is at the very lowest level, people, your product solves functionality problems. It just delivers a minimum feature set. But the top level, the kind of products that people rave about, the kind of products that people evangelize, they're very personally meaningful. And you get there by focusing on the experience of the product, not just on the functionality. How do you make sure you have a good experience? Well, one of the ways is to be human. We talked about people you don't like. The kind of people you don't like, you dislike the same kind of software. You dislike negative software. You dislike software that's late. You dislike software that's rude. You dislike software that doesn't give you any feedback, right? If a software is non-responsive, it's like being in a traffic jam. It's a bad user or waiting for a guy to call you back. It's a bad experience, right? And in contrast, when you are human, when you're really fun, when people like you and you like them, and you communicate with people when things happen, you give them feedback, you tell them what you're doing, you tell them how long they have to wait, you tell them what they have to do next, or you tell them where they are and how to get around, that ends up creating a much more meaningful experience. So simplifying wayfinding and giving feedback, being human, those are ways that you can make your experience a lot better instead of just focusing on your functionality. So now I want to do another exercise. You guys previously talked with your partner about experiences that you hate, right? So I want you to pick one of those experiences and talk about how you would redesign that interaction to be more meaningful, right? So some of the ways that you can think about interaction design improvements, there's a couple strategies. One is what we did earlier, which is we had you role play the interaction live. Because when you role play, sometimes you realize like what's awkward or the information that's not being provided. You can also write down a script. So instead of role playing and talking to each other, you can just write down, okay, player enters the room. Player asks, where do I find my my widget that does X, right? And so you can just write it out instead of talking if that's easier for you. Another thing you can do is take a complex task and break it down into really, really granular steps, and then figure out maybe if any of them can be eliminated, if any of them can be combined. Another thing you can do is just eliminate choices. So a lot of times, software that's not intuitive just overloads you with options, and it's a really negative user experience because you have to work for it when you really just want to be on vacation. Fifth is looking for feedback opportunities. A lot of times bad interactions are bad because you interact with it and then you have no idea what happened. You're like, did you get my form or what? I just filled out 100 form fields. What happened? And then 6 is replacing words with taps. So anytime a user has to input information, if you have to search in a search bar versus just navigate through tabs, that's more cognitive load and more work for the user than if they can just hover over a bar and find what they want. So in a lot of cases, bad interactions can be replaced by just giving people more wayfinding opportunities that require less of their own user input. So yeah, remember that interaction that you hate, or a couple interactions you hate, and then talk with your partner. It doesn't have to be the same partner, it could be a different partner, about how you would fix that interaction. As we discussed earlier, design is a very, very iterative process. So, we talked about, user research, information architecture, interaction design, but really you're not doing these one by one. You're constantly changing. For example, you may have, a website already, but you're still going to do usability testing. You're still going to kind of ask users what they think about it. You're still going to be doing user research. You still might change your information architecture. You're constantly improving your information architecture, and you're constantly improving your interaction design. So design is a very iterative process. You're not just doing one piece at a time. You're constantly empathizing, defining, redefining, reprototyping, retesting different ideas. So in terms of what generally happens is like very loosely you start very open-ended. Very generative, you start with user research. And as you become more and more refined, you define your information architecture. When you have an information architecture, then you define your interactions and the controls on your site. And this funnel goes from very open, very, very creative, to being more and more and more refined until you have a product. But your product is constantly changing, right? And one way that you get feedback about your product is usability engineering. So that is the last big section of user experience design that we're going to talk about today. So usability engineering, if you remember, is the art and science of user testing. Remember that when you're testing a product with a user, they are mostly just looking at the interface. So you might not get a ton of understanding about the user and his behaviors like you would in user research, but you do get feedback on how good is your visual design, your user interface design. If your information architecture is bad, you will know because users will not be able to find things. So usability engineering is basically when you have a product, when you have a prototype, you want to understand how users are actually interacting with it. So there's 4 different kinds of testing or engineering that you want to do. One is exploring, right? And in this case, what you want to understand is You want to explore like what a user's mental model is of a function or a task. And so usability engineering in this particular kind, you do it a little bit earlier on in phases of design. For example, you may have a user test your competitors' apps and talk about how they feel about your competitors' apps, because then you start to understand, okay, what is their model? Maybe based on past experience, maybe based on existing solutions. That's an example of exploring with usability engineering earlier in the design phase. Another example is comparing, right? So, and the objective here is you want to see what a user's reaction is to multiple implementations of a tool and determine advantages and disadvantages. For example, when you're prototyping early ideas, you may have 2 or 3 different versions that you think might be a good idea. Well, how do you decide which version you actually build? So in this particular case, you may show a user, 4 or 5 different early prototypes, maybe 4 or 5 different sketches. You might test a couple different user flows. Maybe you want to try 2 completely different taxonomies, 2 different classifications of organization. This is what you do when you're trying to compare possibilities and figure out which one is actually better. Another thing you might do in usability testing is to assess. This is one of the most, probably the most common form, is you want to tell, okay, I picked a design, we have a product, how effective is this design? So this tends to happen mid to late stage of the design cycle because you have to have something to assess. If you're still ideating, there's nothing to assess. So in this example, one possible thing you could do is ask a user to perform a specific task and then analyze how well it was performed based on qualitative and quantitative measures. Right? For example, you could record and analyze a user's clicks and visit lengths on a page. And the last thing is validating, which is, maybe you can assess, but once you have the number, what is the point, right? A lot of times you want to make sure you meet a certain minimum requirement. So, for example, you may have a minimum conversion rate you have to have on your landing page, on your checkout page, for your business to be successful. So when you validate, you're really trying to assess for the purposes of measuring up against the benchmark. When you're doing usability engineering, you're usually measuring just a handful of things, right? You're measuring things like the time it takes to complete a task, the accuracy. When you ask someone to do something, how accurately did they perform it? Recall. How well does a user remember something about your product? And then 4 is emotional response. I mean, you can measure a lot more than this, but these tend to be the 4 that people measure in usability testing. So there's a bunch of different usability engineering methods, and we'll go slowly through them. The reason why, so usability testing, usability engineering, the reason why I say usability engineering is you're going to find that a lot of these methods require that you either use like technical software or you have some kind of like data, analytical, or technical background because you have to set up a lot of these tests, and these tests have to integrate with your product. But there is a combination of both qualitative and quantitative methods. So I'm going to start with the more qualitative ones, right? One of the most common ones is a heuristic evaluation. This is also called an expert review. Basically, in this particular case, you hire expert designers to come and review your product. So they're designers who are very familiar with best practices, maybe designers who are familiar with the competitors in your space, and you have them just analyze your app, list all of the issues, list the priority, and maybe even list a recommendation for how to fix it. So that's one of, a very common usability engineering method. And usually what you'd want to do is you want to have more than one evaluator, obviously, because one evaluator may not catch everything. So in this particular case, I think there were, 13 evaluators, some number of evaluators, and not all of them caught all of the problems. But by having so many of them, you're able to catch a lot of the hard problems. So another thing you do is feedback surveys, right? We talked earlier how you can do user research with surveys. You can obviously also get feedback on your products by popping up a survey when a user leaves the page. Maybe you can email your users a survey and ask them what was your experience. The other thing is bug reporting and bug analytics, right? So you get a lot of information analyzing your bug reports in a systematic way, but a lot of times in a company, designers act like bug reporting and bug analysis is an engineer's job. But in reality, we talked about how user experience is everything your user encounters, right? It could be your server speed can affect it, your technical support can affect it, and bugs in your software definitely affect it. So as a designer, you definitely want to understand, one, you want to make it easy to capture bugs and capture feedback. Two, you do want to have a process for analyzing bugs, figuring out if there are patterns in the bugs, and connecting them with user issues. Another thing is recall studies. When you're an entrepreneur or a designer and you spend all day, every day working on a product, you know everything about it. But realistically, a user is going to stay on your page for maybe a couple seconds, right? So let's try a recall test. All right, what's the product name? What? Does anybody, how many people remember the product name? Raise your hand if you remember the product name. Okay. What does the product do? Does anybody know what that product does? Nobody knows what the product does. So I let you see that website for 5 seconds. Realistically, when a user comes to your site, they probably bounce within 5 seconds. So a lot of times it's very useful to do these kind of recall tests because you spend forever obsessing over your landing page. You worry like, let me change the copy here and there. Realistically, a user's only going to look at it for a couple seconds, so you need to make sure your language really pops. That in 5 seconds, someone can really understand what is your value proposition and hopefully also remember your name. Right? So another common usability engineering tactic is task-based studies. So task-based studies is pretty straightforward. If you're testing a platform, you want to figure out what are the most critical tasks, how are people performing these tasks, what are their success rates. For example, on Facebook, you may want to have somebody upload a photo album and see how well they do. On Expedia, you may want to ask them to book a flight and hotel, see how well they do. On Amazon, find a specific item and purchase it. How successful are they? And then on Google, locate specific information. So I want you guys to practice doing a task-based usability test. Originally, we were supposed to do it on your own products because we were going to sketch your products. We didn't have time to do that. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to pick an app, any app, maybe an app you use often. Think of something you do in that app, and then find a partner and ask them to do that. Give them your phone, watch them perform that task in your app. So go ahead and find a partner. You should find someone you haven't worked with before. And then pick an app, think of a task, and then hand your phone or hand your computer over and ask the person to perform the task and just watch them do it.
Have used Feedly. It's like a RSS feed reader on iPhone, and I wanted him to find a topic and then add the RSS feed on the phone. And he kept on trying to look for the add button, but he couldn't find it, so he went everywhere. He was looking, pressing all the buttons, and then until he accidentally found the add button, and then he just clicked on it. So it was
did you realize you had succeeded?
I did, but
okay.
I had a really hard time finding the add button.
Yeah, why was that?
Well, apparently she pointed it out that actually the add button actually appeared a few times, but I didn't see it because it was too obscure and yeah.
I think it was because he saw, because when the news feed comes up, it's like the picture of the article comes up, and then he was just attracted to the picture, and then he just clicked on the picture, so he didn't look anywhere else.
Okay. Does anybody else have some funny usability fails or usability challenges? Any difficult apps here? Did anybody successfully find your TV?
Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
So here.
Oh.
Yeah, talk about it.
Okay, hi everyone. Basically, I just gave my task to 2 persons. Okay, and then both of them couldn't find the task that I gave them, because the task that I gave them is the Lazada app, the online marketplace, okay? So I asked them to, I need two information from there. So, okay, I want to buy a Toshiba 32-inch LED TV, and you give me two information that I want. First is a warranty, and the second is a delivery time, and I asked them to find. And end up, they couldn't find it. Then, so that's the things that I find it surprisingly, because when you want to buy something, definitely you need to know what is the warranty period for that particular TV, and how long does it take to deliver to your house. Yeah.
All right. So this is very common on, you know, a lot of complex sites. People try to find important information that helps them make a purchase, and they can't find it. So let's talk about some ways to test for that, and hopefully make your app a lot more usable than some of the apps that you've been testing. So so especially with navigation problems, like when you're trying to ask a user to find a specific piece of information using a navigation, something you could do is called tree testing. Tree testing is like the opposite of card sorting, right? So you'll kind of tell somebody, hey, you know, let's say you're on a telecom website, right? And you want someone to maybe update their address in their account, right? And so what you can do is you can have them go through your product, and you can measure, you know, how many times did they go down the right path, how many times did they go down the wrong path, how many times did they have to reverse their direction, how many times did they like fail the task, right? And there's a ton of software out there that helps you do tree testing. So this is something that could be done fairly easily once you have a product out. But for example, like this is like an example from a telecom website's usability test. It's like you're about to move house, and you want to transfer your phone and your internet to the new address. Kind of important, right? You kind of, if you want to keep your telecom operator, you kind of want to update your address. How would you do that? And so they measured, you know, how people went down the tree and what their failure rates were. So it looks like, you know, 45% people found it directly. They found it immediately, so it was quite easy. But then 17% of people completely failed. That's pretty bad, because if somebody moves and, you know, almost 20% of your users, when they move, cannot update their address, they will no longer be your telecom customers. Or they're going to give an angry email to customer support, and you're going to incur angry customer support costs. So doing this kind of task analysis and being very quantitative about it really helps you pinpoint where people are having problems. So tree testing is a way to test your navigational capability. So for example, we talked about interaction design. You want to simplify wayfinding. You want to help your user figure out where they are relative to the system and how to find any specific piece of information. Things that affect that are the quality of your information architecture, the quality of your interaction design, right? So if you have bad information architecture, for example, you know, if you're going to buy a $3,000 TV, don't you want to know what the warranty is? Don't you want to know what the delivery date is? Why is it that I can't find that information? Clearly, you know, someone didn't think about, you know, their users, their needs, and organizing information in a way that would facilitate making a purchase. So for example, you can measure like direct success rate. Indirect success is when somebody like went a roundabout way. So as you notice, in most of your usability tests, most people did not figure something out right away, right? They missed the button the first time, they went to the wrong sub-tab, maybe they did something that was just flat out wrong and they had to undo it and do it again. So very rarely, I mean, how many people had someone succeed on the first try right away in your usability test? Nobody. Nobody had somebody succeed immediately right away. That's very common on mobile. So the way you figure, you can use software to measure it. You can also measure it yourself. For example, you can, when you're watching somebody, time them. You can track whether they succeeded or failed. You can do it manually, but it's a lot easier when you use software. And if you just look at tree testing software, there's just a lot of options out there. So you measure like direct success. Did they take the most direct path? Indirect success. Did they eventually figure it out? How long did they figure it out? Did they fail, right? Did they give up? Or did it take too long to complete the task? Like you have to define what you define as failure. So did that answer your question? Okay. It's navigation testing, it's wayfinding testing, it's your content organization testing. It's also your UI testing, right? For example, in the case where they tested Feedly, I saw it, the add button was so light, it was like gray on white background. Gray on white background, he missed it every single time until the very end, right? So it tests a lot of things, not just your navigation. It could tell you there's something wrong, this button isn't obvious enough. So another thing you might want to do is screen recording. So today you just casually observed, right? But when you record it, you can look at it more methodically, and you can identify, oh, I see that, he hovered over the plus sign but didn't push it and then went back over here. Why did that happen, right? So when you record the screen, you get a lot more information about how a user is actually interacting with that app. You might see, okay, my finger's hovering over a certain thing, that user's thinking something, but they didn't push that button. Why did they push that button? So you get really detailed information about how someone's thinking about using the app. The thing I will say about screen recording is it's pretty hard to do for mobile. In this particular case, there's somebody using a mobile app, sitting at a desk in an office. Doesn't happen very often, right? Most of the time you're using your apps when you're out and about. Now, you thought usability was hard here. Imagine when you're just like, you're on the bus, you're trying to add something to your RSS feed. Are you more or less likely to find that button versus when you're sitting in your office, right? So with mobile, it's kind of difficult to record your screen. Sometimes what people do is they have these things called mobile sleds. This is called a sled, which is a camera that mounts onto your phone that tries to record. Because it's very important to record the hand as well. Because on the web, you can see when the mouse is hovering over something, right? But on the mobile, you can't tell whether your finger is hovering over something. So you need to capture that full screen. Whereas on the web, you can do something like Camtasia. You can show the mouse clicks. You can see what the mouse is hovering over. So it's a little bit easier on web than it is on mobile. So another thing you can do is in-house usability testing. So that's where you invite people to come in and you do a combination of things. One, you observe them without telling them how to use the app, of course. You record their fingers, but then you also want to make sure that you record, for example, their facial expressions and what they're thinking and what they're saying. Because you might be able to see, somebody might be hovering, and you look at their facial expressions, you realize that they're really confused at a certain point. So that's very helpful for you to learn more about, why is it so difficult to do what seems like a basic task, right? Like add a news article to your RSS feed seems like it should be easy. Figure out what the warranty is on a high-profile, big purchase, like a TV. That should be pretty straightforward, right? Add a stock to your watch list seems like it should be straightforward. So a lot of things that seem like they're obvious, what you learn is they're actually really not obvious, especially on mobile, especially when you're out and about using your mobile device. So, and also Cheryl told me that after the renovation, you guys are going to have a fancy usability lab here. So there's then no excuse to not do your usability testing. So the other thing about usability testing is you don't need to have a fully fledged app to do your testing, right? You can do usability testing with earlier prototypes, right? So if we had the time, I gave you index cards because index cards are a really good way to sketch out mobile experiences and then have kind of a fake interface that you can use to test with people. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll sketch an idea for a mobile interface and I'll take it to a coffee shop and wait in line and then show people, I'm going to say, hey, please use my app to perform a task. And I want to see that by the time we get to the front of the line, they're done with that task. I can test how fast a task takes. So you don't have to, necessarily have a fully fledged app. You can test partial prototypes as long as some of the functionality is there. You can test paper prototypes, which we would have done had we had the time to do the sketches, or you can test fully fledged apps. And there are some cases where you might not want to test a prototype too early in the field, right? For example, what if you're designing a new UX for a car dashboard? And it's like a really early design and you haven't tested it. Are you going to take that on the road and have a person drive using your untested design? Maybe not. So it may make sense to do a lot of the testing, the basic testing in a lab, using a more casual interface because you don't want to endanger lives when you are doing your usability engineering. So another thing that you can do is remote testing. So one of the challenges with usability testing is, remember we talked about in user research, if you recruit the wrong users, you're going to have bad data. Same thing happens with usability testing, is you may have ideal users that don't live in your area, right? Or that are hard to access. It's hard to get them to come into your office. It's hard to watch them, to go to them to watch them use the mobile app or use your website, in their context. So you can do remote testing, and there's a ton of products out there that do user testing that actually recruit and have people do user testing for you. For example, this is an example of a video from Usability. I think the sound is not working. Hold on.
It's kind of deceptive.
Hold on, let me try that again. Oh no.
How about sign me up? Clicking on sign me up. Oh, that's not the actual sign me up button. It's just a picture of it apparently. It's kind of deceptive. Where is the sign me up button? I clicked here. Okay, I understand this is a picture of the sign me up button, but where do you go to actually do that?
So do you see in that particular case, what happened was there was a tutorial that had a picture of the interface, and he tried to click on the picture of the tutorial, and then he got confused because it wasn't the actual sign me up button. So his job was to sign up for an Amazon program. And a lot of times what these services do is they record the screen and they record the face. And sometimes they also provide like heat maps and all this other stuff. And you can quickly see, you can order a bunch of different tests. You can have 10 users perform a certain task, and then you can watch, okay, I understand why this person didn't know how to sign me up. He's getting confused because the tutorial has a picture of the button, but it's not the actual button, which is kind of a funny problem to have. So when you're doing usability engineering, there is a lot of concerns that you need to be aware of to make sure that you do testing correctly. For example, like in user research, you need to make sure that your user sample is actually reflective of the kind of audience that you're targeting. Because remember, bad recruiting equals bad research. And one of the biggest problems is not testing enough people. So you test one person, maybe this person is just really bad at using photo apps, right? Maybe they don't, because they never use photo apps, they don't recognize specific icons that somebody who's more of an expert user would recognize. So generally speaking, when you're trying to test a specific problem, like for a specific task, you can usually catch it with about 5 users, right? So if you have 5 people do the exact same task on your app, that'll catch, maybe like 75% of the problems. So if you're going to do usability testing, try to have at least 5 people test your app to catch most of the usability problems. Another challenge with usability engineering is test design. So if you design a test poorly, you're going to have bad results. So you need to make sure that your tests are scientifically sound. So let me give you an example of a badly designed test. So when the iPhone came out, there was a UX design consultancy that did a study that showed that the iPhone keyboard was worse than QWERTY keyboards. The way they did the study was first they recruited 20 people. So many, very statistically significant number of people, right? 20 people. And they picked people who had never used an iPhone before. And the test that they had them do was they had them type something using their own phone and using the iPhone. 20 people had to type something using their own phone and then using the iPhone. So what do you think happened? They obviously did a lot better on their own phone because it's their own phone. They're used to typing on whatever keyboard they have on their phone. And they typed a lot slower on an iPhone because not a single one of them had used an iPhone before. So that's an example where you just have really bad test parameters. You're going to have very skewed results because you designed the test in a scientifically unsound way, right? Another way you can misdesign a test is not considering context. For example, when you're sitting, when you're relaxed, and maybe doing tasks is a lot easier. But what you really should be testing is, when somebody's actually using your app live, let's say they're going shopping with it, you should see what the usability problems are there. Maybe if you have an app that's meant to be used outside, the glare is so bad they can't even see what's going on, right? So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but some GPS systems, they're white. They have a white background during the daytime and a darker background at night. The reason is that when that white background is on when you're driving at night, it gives you so much glare that you can't see the road, right? So they discovered that after like observing over time, people were having a difficult time looking at this GPS at night. The only way you would find that out is if you did usability testing on the actual road, you did usability testing in the actual environment. So you need to make sure that your test is reflective of how people will actually be using your product. Another challenge is the observer effect. So, you know, when you are being observed, you're kind of more self-conscious and you behave a little bit differently than you would when you're actually using the app by yourself. For example, if someone has paid you to come into a lab to test an app, you're going to try a lot harder, right? Because you're sitting there, you're like, okay, well, you know, I should concentrate more. But like we said before, you know, most users are not going to try that hard. Like, you give them a little bit of crap, they have a little bit of struggle, they're gone. They're not even going to think about your product. They're going to look at your site for 5 seconds and not remember who you are. But if you hire somebody to come into your lab, they're obviously going to spend a lot more time. And there's a lot of other things too, right? Maybe some people get nervous. They're like, oh my God, I'm being watched. Maybe some people perform worse. So you need to recognize that when you have this observation, you might change the behavior a little bit. Another thing that happens is training effect. What training effect is when somebody becomes used to a system, they obviously become better, right? So when you test a novice and you tell them to do something in Photoshop, they're going to have a worse time than somebody who has used Photoshop for years, right? Now, this happens in a very minor way when you're testing competitive apps. So let's say you're doing studies, usability studies on photo apps, and you want a user to test 3 different apps, the same task in 3 different apps. By the time the user gets to that 3rd app, they're probably going to be a lot better than when they were at the first app. So if you test the apps in the same order, you might conclude that app number 1 has worse usability than app number 3, but it could be that app number 3, by the time they got to app number 3, they recognized the icon, they understood the flow, they understood how photo apps worked. So the way you try to mitigate this is when you're testing very similar apps where you think there might be a training effect, try to change the order. So if you're going to test Hipstamatic, Instagram, and Retro, in one user you say Hipstamatic, Instagram, Retro, and another user you say do Retro, Hipstamatic, and Instagram. So you mix up the order. That way, at least some of the training effect is gone. But the thing is, you have to remember that this is still true just for your own website, right? So maybe you have a user come in and you want them to do 5 different things on your website. On the first task, they're completely new. They don't know what your navigation is. So they click around, they learn some information, and maybe the first task they do really badly because they didn't understand your site. By the time they get to the 5th task, they've been trained on your site. So maybe you think that 5th task is less well designed, but it could just be a training effect. So even within your own website, you want to make sure you vary the task schedule and vary the order so that you mitigate training effect. The 2 other things we're going to talk about, statistical significance and validity, we will talk about later. So let's move into more quantitative methods for usability tracking. So when you have a product, one thing that you can do is click and eye tracking, right? So with this, you're tracking where are people clicking, where are people hovering, where are people's eyes going. So for example, if you're looking at Google search results, most people looking at Google search results only look at the first 3 results. So if you're ranked number 5, you wonder, or you're ranked number 10, and you wonder why you don't have traffic, this will tell you. Another thing is, when you look at eye tracking, you're going to understand why people miss buttons. For example, in the case of Feedly, there was this light gray button all the way on the side, right? So when you track the eyes, you're going to realize the person didn't even look in that area. And that's why they completely missed the button. So doing eye tracking and turning these into heat maps can be very useful if you're finding that users are not finding things and not getting the content that they need. Another thing you can do is path analysis or flow reports. This is kind of similar to doing tree testing, but just more overall, right? So overall, you can sort of see how are people coming in, and where are people branching into. And this is just Google Analytics, which is a free product, right? So when you hook Google Analytics into your product, they have mobile and they have regular web support. They'll break down flow reports for you, and you can edit them as you need to. And tells you how people are moving through your app. Another thing you can do is split testing, so A/B testing. I get a lot of questions about A/B testing. There are things that you have to remember. Number one, when you have low volume, frankly, if you're not Google and you don't have like millions of users, when you are low volume, testing really minor changes have wasted your time. So for example, this is a very minor change, and unless you have a ton of volume, like tens of thousands of people every day, you're not going to get enough statistical significance for the wide variety of these kinds of minor tests, right? So what you should be doing if you do have enough volume for A/B testing is to test things that are very different. So for example, a list-based navigation versus icon-based navigation. That can actually tell you, okay, this type of navigation is working better than the other versus you're just testing text copy. Right? Generally speaking, when you have lower volume, you want to make sure you concentrate your testing on more structural changes rather than just minor changes. Another thing you want to do is funnel analysis. So it's one subset of flow diagrams. It's just looking at your registration funnel or your checkout funnel. So for sites, there's usually just a couple of key things a user needs to do: sign up and registration, as well as checkout or like invite. So in this case, you can do this automatically with tools like Google Analytics. There's also a bunch of other funnel analytics tools you can use. But this just helps you understand like how many people made it to a certain point, right? Where are your drop-offs? Like if you notice that a lot of people get to midway and then they bounce, that tells you there's something wrong about that point in your flow, and you need to take a look at it. So for example, shopping cart is a really, if you're an e-commerce site, how easy it is to check out is a really big piece of how well your site performs. So you're going to want to analyze your funnels in a very detailed way if possible. Another thing you want to do, which is longer term, is cohort analysis. So when you do usability testing, you just test a task. It's kind of one-off, right? But a lot of times when you want to understand how a user's relationship changes over time with your product. That is what cohort analysis helps you do. What cohort analysis does is it segments your users based on when they signed up, and then it looks at your metrics based on cohorts of people who sign up at different times. So this particular picture shows you the engagement percentage based on when they signed up. What that helps you do is, let's say you made a big redesign in March, right? You want to see how this redesign affected your retention rate. Right? So you need to compare January, February, what was that retention rate over X number of months, and how did March change from that? If you don't split it out by when they signed up, you might be clumping data together. You might be getting wrong statistics because you're clumping data instead of segmenting users out correctly based on when you made a design change. So when you're thinking about more quantitative methods, the most important thing you need to remember is statistical significance and validity, because it's very easy to run a lot of tests and pretend you did something, but actually have them be statistically invalid. So again, A/B testing. People always ask me about A/B testing. Most of the time, if you're a startup, you do not have enough volume to do any kind of meaningful A/B testing. You should be focusing on these other usability engineering methods or other UX design methods. But if you do have enough volume, there's tons of software out there that helps you decide whether an A/B test was significant or not significant from a purely statistical standpoint, right? But just because you have a result that's statistically significant does not mean it is a valid result. So let me tell you about a common problem, which is a lot of times when you do an A/B test, you get really varied results immediately. So maybe the first day, the first week, you're going to see a huge difference in the performance. But then over time, it starts to even out, it starts to converge. Why does this happen? It happens because, users come in at different times, right? So for example, here's an example of a test where it's been running for, I think, 2 or 3 days, and it looks like the new variation is a lot worse than the original, right? So it looks like it's failing relative to the original, and the significance is really, really high, right? So you have enough volume to make the data significant. But then this is the same picture, but 4 weeks later. And you can see that the variation 1 is now outperforming the original. The reason why this happens is you have users coming in at different times, right? So if you're doing, say, expense reporting, maybe a user only comes in, once a month to make certain changes. Or, or you might have different kinds of users come in at different times. Like some people come in on 1 month, some people come in on another month. The point is that there's seasonality in how people use your app. So when you only run an A/B test for like 1 or 2 days, or a week, it may be possible that some of your users haven't even logged into your app, or whatever function they perform, they haven't even done that function. So generally speaking, you want to run, if you want to increase validity, you want to run all of your quantitative tests for at least 4 weeks or longer. Because generally speaking, your active users will have signed in within a monthly period, right? Any less than that, and you can't be really sure that you have covered your entire user base. There's also effects like, for example, if I use your site a lot and then you put me on an A/B test, maybe I see a new design and I kind of increases my engagement. But then once I get used to it, it actually ends up just going down to regular. So there's all these effects that happen when you don't test quantitative tests long enough. So when you do any kind of A/B testing, any kind of quantitative data acquisition, you want to make sure you run your tests for at least 4 weeks. Otherwise, you can't be really sure that they're valid. The longer you run it, the more valid the results are. Another thing is you want to pre-calculate a minimum sample size. There's software that helps you do this if you don't really understand statistics. But a lot of times, something that you want to test, you want to make sure in advance that you can actually get the minimum sample size to be statistically significant before you even run that test. Otherwise, it's a slight waste of your time. And then when you do run the test, you want to make sure your statistical significance is over 95%. So if you don't know how to calculate that yourself, there's a lot of tools out there that help you determine whether an experiment result is statistically significant. So let's review. We covered a lot of usability engineering methods. We talked about heuristic evaluation, also called expert review. That is when you hire an expert, a professional designer with a lot of experience, to go through and evaluate your site based on their best practices and their knowledge. Feedback surveys, bug reporting, that's something that you should already be doing. It's pretty obvious, just asking your customers what they think and then looking at the bugs file to see what the problems are. Recall studies. I showed you a website for 5 seconds. Nobody could remember the name. Nobody could remember what it did. That's exactly what users do when they're on your website. Nobody sits for 5 minutes analyzing your copy, except for maybe your competitors, right? So a user is going to allocate a lot less memory to your product than you allocate to yourself. So you can't just assume they're going to remember things about you. Task-based studies, that's the #1 thing that's being tested in usability engineering. And you did a quick study. You gave someone a task, and you watched them do it. And when I asked, hey, who finished their task right away, perfectly, first time, not a single one of you raised your hand. So the thing about usability studies is a lot of times you think something might be simple, you think you may have designed something intuitively, chances are you did not, and that's why you need to observe users in action. And some of the ways you can analyze tasks is, one, by doing a tree testing. So there's software that can track which paths your users go down, and then help you break down, what percentage was successful, what percentage backtracked, where did they backtrack, what percentage failed. Screen recording, that's more qualitative. You record the screen, you look at the person's expression, the person's hover pattern, their actual taps, try to understand what the problem is. Remote testing lets you test that at scale, right? And we saw the example of the guy who was testing Amazon. He got confused because he looked at the tutorial that had a picture of the button, but couldn't find the actual button of how to sign up. When you have a product, you can be more quantitative. So click and eye tracking helps you figure out what are people looking at. If people are having difficulty performing a task, are they not seeing a button? Maybe you should make a button more visible. Split testing, funnel analysis, cohort analysis. Split testing can help you figure out which design variation is better than the other, but you have to make sure you don't test minor stuff, because unless you have millions of users coming to your site, you're not going to get enough data about those kind of minor issues. So you want to make sure that when you split test, try to test bigger pieces of functionality and bigger changes in design. And then funnel analysis and cohort analysis. Cohort analysis is the one that helps you test for user engagement over time, right? When you split users that come in on different times, you can figure out how your redesign has been affecting your users by looking at their retention over time as compared to users that signed up on earlier periods. So in your workbook, there is a exercise sheet where you create a usability testing plan. So it's kind of similar to user research, except you're going to do it for usability testing now that you understand all the different kinds of ways to test for usability. So what you want to do is first you have to define scope, which is what are you testing? What are you testing? Why are you testing it? What are your objectives? What are your concerns? What are your questions? What are your goals? What kind of participants are you going to get? How many users? What type of user? Location, where are you going to conduct your location? Are you going to do research in-house with recording all sorts of things? Are you going to do guerrilla research, just watching people use apps in the field? What are you going to do? What are your scenarios? What are you asking a user to do? And what are your questions? What are you asking the users? What kind of data are you going to collect? What is your setup? What technology are you going to use? And then roles. Who's going to do what, right? So a lot of times when you're doing usability testing, you're observing a user, or maybe you're interacting with a user, and you need someone else to take notes, right? So take a quick attempt at this user testing guide. The one thing I want to say based on my observation is, when you design scenarios, when you have something that you want the user to do, it's a little bit more useful when you give them a very discrete task that has a success or a fail metric that's very clear. So when you say, please find this specific TV and give me this specific warranty information, you can measure whether that user succeeded or failed. But if you're like, hey, just look at this app, okay, well, how do you tell if a user looked at the app well or looked at the app poorly? There's no way to measure it. So when you design your scenarios, when you design your questions, make sure you design something that can actually be analyzed versus something that's just going to be kind of like a fluffy gauge on your part. Let's start to wrap up your usability test planning. You have this as reference, so when you do need to plan usability for your actual product, you can always refer back to this to make sure that you're covering all your bases. So today we learned a lot. You guys have been in here for almost, 7 hours now. So we covered 4 big pieces of user experience design. One is user research. That is when you try to understand how users behave and why. This is very open-ended, and you're just trying to you're asking very open-ended questions as to why people do things, how they do things, to understand better what their habits, their behaviors, their motivations, their goals are. When you do your user research and you need to crystallize your data, information architecture helps you turn your research into more discrete understanding. For example, you could take your user research and turn it into personas to better understand your archetypal users. You can turn your user research into a taxonomy for your site so that you understand the best classification system given your users' mental models. When you have your information architecture, then you can figure out interaction design. Interaction design is when you design controls, design affordances. And if you remember, an affordance is an element of an object that teaches you how to use it. And we talked about a lot of cases where it was either well designed, very clear, or improperly designed, very unclear. And finally, when you have a product, when you have a prototype, you can use usability engineering to test whether or not it is successful or not, whether people can actually use the product. So I just want to have a little pop quiz, and I want to see what you guys can remember from the presentation. So first question, what is the difference between user interface design and user experience design? Wait, hold on.
User interface is the spoon, while user experience is the cereal they eat.
What does that mean?
User interface is sort of that point of, I think it's that point where you kind of touch the product. It's the tool that you handle, whereas experience is that sort of feelings you get,
something like that.
Yeah. Anybody else have an answer for this question? All right. Pop quiz. What's the difference between UI and UX design?
Okay, in my experience, I think the UX is more like the human. We communicate with something like humans. They know what we need. Maybe the interface can be like tool, just use it.
Okay. Anybody else? Let's see. What's the difference between user interface and user experience design?
The user interface is just the visual part, how you see it, and the experience is how you feel it.
Okay. Do you guys remember that layer diagram that I showed you? The top 2 layers are user interface. The rest of the layers are user experience. And like you mentioned, when you think about user interface, that's just what your user can see, right, of your product, the interface of your product. But user experience is everything your user experiences about your company. That can be anywhere from your ad copies, your marketing copies, how fast or slow your server is, your customer support. That is your whole user experience related to a particular product. What are the layers of user experience design? Don't look at your worksheet. Don't cheat. Don't cheat. What are the layers of user experience design? You can just have a couple guesses. You don't have to be perfectly correct. Can you name one layer of user experience design? No, too much pressure. Do you know? Do you know? No? Who knows? What are the layers of user experience design? You do?
The IA.
Which one?
The information architecture.
So that's one layer, right? That's one layer of user experience design. What is another layer of user experience design? Here, hold on. Yeah?
Strategy, scope.
Yeah. So that's one layer, that's the bottom layer, right? Bottom 2 layers. What is the difference between strategy and scope?
It draws out the architecture of the application design.
So strategy is, what are your business goals? What are your product goals? What are your user goals, right? It's the most base layer. Scope is, once you've defined your goals, what is the subset of functional requirements you're actually going to implement? That's the second layer. Third layer is your information architecture. How is the data organized? Fourth layer is your UI. How's your interface laid out? And the final layer is your visual design, which is your, what colors and typography you use. So make sure you look at that user experience. I put the layers in your workbook, and you can take a look and refresh your memory. Name 3 user research methods. Can you name just one user research method?
Heuristic.
That's a usability testing method. So user research is earlier in the design phase when you're just trying to understand how users behave, right? So name one user research method?
User interview.
Yeah, user interview is one of the most popular user research methods. Can you name another one?
Surveys.
Surveys, another excellent user research method. Can you name one?
Diary.
Diary studies, excellent. All right, diary studies are really good when you want more objective logging. What is information architecture and why is it important for UX design? Who thinks they have a good answer for this? Do you have a good explanation for information architecture?
It's the way things are organized on the site so that people can find them easily.
So that's one definition, right, is having a navigation structure that allows people to understand where to find content on your site. Information architecture is basically how you organize data and how you organize content to create valuable information, right? It's important for user experience because if you don't have a very strong information architecture, you as a designer, don't have a very good organization of your app. Like, for example, if you don't do user flows, you're not going to have effective wireframes because you don't understand what the whole process is. If you don't have a clear taxonomy, you're going to have poor navigation because you don't actually even understand classification systems that make sense for your users. All right, what is an affordance and how do you make one that is effective? Do you know what an affordance is? No. Okay, who knows what an affordance is? Huh. Do you know what an affordance is? Nobody knows what an affordance is.
Something that the users would allow to do something and they know what to do with it, like a button or a slider.
Perfect, yeah. So how do you know that you scoop with a spoon and that you cut with a knife? Right? An affordance is an aspect of that design that communicates to you how you use a tool. Right? How do you make an effective affordance?
Make it obvious.
Okay, yeah. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. If you have a button, you need to make it clear that the button's being pressed. The button needs to communicate the state of the system, right? So an example of a good affordance is something that gives feedback. When you push a button, it goes down. That communicates to the user that it's been pushed, right? All right, name 3 principles of interaction design, right? That's a middle layer. Can you name one principle of interaction design?
Be human.
Be human. What is an example of not being human?
Being not human. Okay, something like Internet Explorer type of interface. It's not.
Why is it not human?
It's not intuitive. We don't because for a human, you actually you only have a pair of eyes. You look at a place, but if you have too much information, then it's not easily processed.
So it's not human because let's say you're having a conversation with somebody. You ask them a question and they talk for half an hour. That's awkward, right? That's the same thing when you have an interface that has too much information. You just want to do one thing and you talk for half an hour. Socially awkward. What's another principle of interaction design? No cheating, no cheating. Don't look at your work.
Convenient.
Well, okay. Can you name another one?
Functional.
Okay. So that's something that you want your design to do. You certainly want designs that are functional, but remember that triangle diagram we saw, right? Yep. What was the point of that diagram?
So what do you mean? What's the point?
So does everybody remember the diagram we saw that has functionality at the bottom, and then functional, then reliable, then usable, then convenient, and all the way at the top like meaningful, right? The point is that designs that are really good are not just functional. They end up being more than just convenient. They end up being very meaningful. So when you design interactions, you have to focus on experiences and not tasks. That's one principle of interaction design. Are pretty things necessarily usable? Yes or no? If something is pretty, does that mean that it's usable?
No.
No, why? Because just because something is beautiful and simple doesn't mean that it's necessarily usable. We saw a lot of examples of things that were very pretty that were actually not very clear. All right, last question, I promise. We just covered usability testing. So let's see, I'm gonna go over here. Can you name one way to do usability engineering?
Screen recording.
Screen recording, okay. Can you name one way to do usability testing?
Feedback.
Feedback, yeah, so asking customers directly for feedback. One more way to do usability testing.
Bug reporting.
Bug reporting, you should already be doing that, and there's a lot of ways to get valuable design information from usability. So, thank you guys so much. I realized that you had to sit here for hours and learn a lot of material. You have the handouts, so all of that material that we learned today, you can take home with you and review. And when you apply these processes to your own products, you can follow a lot of the guidelines and the thinking for your own products. So thank you so much for listening to me for hours. It's amazing that you guys are still awake right now. If you have questions, you're welcome to email me. You can tweet at me on Twitter at thinkmariya, or you can email me, maria@xanadumobile.com, if you have any questions. Okay, thank you.